"Leave through the back door." Clara's voice cut through the marble hallway like a blade. Damien Vittorio stopped mid-stride, his hand already reaching for the front door handle, the door where two of his own men were waiting to put 3 bullets through his chest. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. A maid had just stopped the most dangerous man in Boston from walking into his own funeral. And the worst part, she had known it was coming before anyone else did. If this story already has your heart pounding, subscribe to our channel right now and follow every twist to the very end. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Clara Bennett had learned one rule before she ever set foot inside the Vittorio estate. Invisible women survive. That was what her mother told her after her father disappeared. That was what the social worker repeated when Clara aged out of the group home at 18. That was what the staffing agency coordinator said the morning she handed Clara a pressed black uniform, a pair of white gloves, and a laminated identification badge with the Vittorio family crest printed in the corner. Keep your eyes on the floor, keep your hands busy, and never under any circumstances repeat anything you hear inside those walls. Clara had nodded. She had smiled. She had folded that badge into her coat pocket with both hands so the coordinator wouldn't see how badly they were shaking. Not from fear. From the effort it took not to say what she was actually thinking. She wasn't there to clean floors. She wasn't there to stay invisible. She was there to find out what happened to her father, and she had been preparing for this moment for 4 years. Her father's name was Robert Bennett. He was a 43-year-old accountant with a quiet laugh, a second-hand briefcase, and a habit of humming old folk songs while he worked through numbers at the kitchen table. He was not a dangerous man. He was not a brave man, at least not in the way movies describe bravery. He was the kind of man who drove 5 miles per hour under the speed limit and always put the grocery cart back in the proper return area even in the rain. He disappeared on a Tuesday morning in October, 6 years before Clara walked through the Vittorio estate's servants' entrance for the first time. He kissed Clara's mother on the cheek at 7:45. He told Clara, then 19, to eat the leftover pasta in the refrigerator before it went bad. He picked up his briefcase and walked out the front door. He never came back. The police found his car parked 3 blocks from his office building. His briefcase was in the back seat. His phone was on the passenger floor screen, shattered. His wallet was still in the glove compartment, with $63 in cash and every credit card untouched. The detective assigned to the case told Clara's mother it was probably a mugging gone wrong. Told her these things happen. Told her they were doing everything they could. They found nothing. 3 months later, the case went cold. 6 months later, Clara's mother stopped eating. 8 months later, Clara was working double shifts at a diner on the edge of downtown, paying the electric bill and watching her mother shrink away from the world like a photograph left too long in the sun. And then, 14 months after her father walked out that front door and vanished, Clara found the envelope. 2. It was tucked inside the lining of his old winter coat, the one her mother had kept hanging in the hallway closet because she couldn't bring herself to donate it. Clara had pulled the coat down to air it out, and she felt the stiffness inside the left pocket lining the crinkle of something hidden and deliberate. She sat on the hallway floor for 40 minutes before she could bring herself to tear it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded into thirds. Her father's handwriting. Small and precise the way he always wrote when he was being careful. If you are reading this, something has happened to me. I cannot say more here. But the name Marco Bellini will tell you everything. Don't go to the police. Go to the records. The money always tells the truth. That was all. No explanation, no apology. No, I love you at the bottom, which was the detail that broke Clara open completely, because her father signed birthday cards with 3 I love yous and always ended phone calls the same way, and the absence of it told her more than the words did. He had been in a hurry. He had been afraid. He had written this note the way a man writes something he expects to be found after he is already gone. Clara folded the paper back into thirds. She put it in her own coat pocket. She sat on that floor until her legs went numb. And then she got up and started researching Marco Bellini. It took her 2 years to understand what she had found. Marco Bellini wasn't a name in any newspaper. He wasn't in any public record she could access. He had no social media presence, no professional listings, no property records she could trace directly to him. He was the kind of man who existed in the spaces between official documents, the kind of man whose influence moved through other people's names. But the money, as her father had promised, told the truth. Clara had inherited her father's talent for numbers. She had put herself through 2 years of accounting courses at a community college while working nights at the diner, and she used everything she learned to follow the financial trails her father had left behind in his own encrypted files. 3 USB drives, hidden inside the false bottom of the old toolbox in their basement, protected by a password that Clara didn't crack until the 3rd month, because it turned out to be the title of the folk song he always hummed. What she found on those drives was a map. Not a literal map, but a financial one. Shell companies. Redirected payments. Ledger entries that had been altered after the fact by someone with access to the original files. Her father had been documenting it for months before he disappeared, tracking money that moved between the Vittorio organization's legitimate real estate holdings and a series of investment accounts that fed back into a network of entities she eventually connected to Marco Bellini. Marco was skimming. Not small amounts. Not careless mistakes. He was systematically redirecting funds on a scale that would have taken the Vittorio operation years to notice, possibly decades, if someone hadn't been looking specifically for the pattern. Her father had been looking. Her father had found it. And then her father had vanished. The Vittorio estate position had taken her 8 months to arrange. She couldn't apply directly. The staffing agency that placed domestic workers in high-security households ran thorough background checks, and she needed her background to be ordinary enough to pass without triggering any flags, but distinctive enough to stand out as a candidate. She spent those 8 months building a carefully constructed persona. References from previous employers, who were in fact friends of friends, coached to confirm a work history Clara had documented in meticulous detail. A certification in hospitality management from an online program she actually completed because she needed to know the material. A social media presence 2 years old, full of the kind of quiet domestic content that told a story of a woman who cared about her work and kept to herself. She got placed first with a retired judge and his wife in Beacon Hill. Worked there for 4 months without a single incident. Built a reputation for discretion, efficiency, and the ability to anticipate what a household needed before anyone asked. That reputation carried her to the Vittorio estate. The morning she walked through those gates for the first time, she kept her eyes down and her face perfectly composed, and inside her chest, her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her back teeth. She had waited 4 years for this. She was not going to waste a single second of it. The Vittorio estate was its own world. Clara had expected something cold, something built to intimidate all hard angles and ostentatious display of wealth. What she found instead was a place that had once been someone's actual home, a home that had been slowly converted over decades into something that served power rather than family. The bones of something warm were still there, in the way the kitchen staff called each other by first name, in the framed photographs still hanging in the upstairs hallway that nobody had bothered to take down. In the way the oldest groundskeeper, a man named Felix, who had worked the property for 30 years, still watered the rose bushes along the east wall every single morning, out of some habit too deep to break. The people who worked there were not criminals. They were cooks and cleaners and drivers and groundskeepers, people who needed jobs and had found one that paid well and asked no questions. They moved through the house carefully, the way people move through spaces where the wrong word to the wrong person can have consequences that don't show up until much later. Clara moved with them. She learned their rhythms. She learned which rooms she was expected to maintain and which she was expected to avoid. She learned the rotation of the security staff, memorizing faces and shifts, and the way certain guards changed their behavior when specific family members were present. She did her job perfectly. And she watched. She had been at the estate for 6 weeks before she first saw Damien Vittorio up close. She had seen him from a distance before that. Caught glimpses across hallways, heard his voice from behind closed doors, watched the way the energy in a room changed when he was about to enter it, the way the other staff straightened slightly, without quite realizing they were doing it. Damien Vittorio was 38 years old and had run the family organization since his father's death 4 years earlier. He was tall-built in the way that suggested someone who had spent years in physical work, rather than a gym, with dark eyes that moved across a room with the particular kind of attention that never fully switched off. He wasn't what people expected when they imagined a crime family head. He didn't wear his power loudly. He dressed well, but simply. He spoke quietly and expected people to lean in to hear him. Clara had observed all of this from a careful distance and cataloged it the way she cataloged everything. Because understanding Damien was not incidental to her mission. Understanding him was central to it. She needed to know whether the man at the top of this organization was complicit in what Marco Bellini was doing, or whether he was another person who simply hadn't been looking in the right direction. What she saw over 6 weeks of careful observation was a man who ran a criminal enterprise with the organizational discipline of a CEO and the paranoia of someone who had learned early and harshly that trust was something people used against you. She also saw once in an unguarded moment the way he looked at the framed photograph at the end of the upstairs hallway. His father and his mother and a small boy between them, all of them squinting against summer sun, the kind of photograph that exists in every family before everything changes. He looked at it for exactly 4 seconds and then kept walking. Clara noted that too. The first time she directly crossed his path, she was carrying a tray of coffee service down the main corridor when he came around the corner from the library, already in conversation with a man she recognized immediately. Marco Bellini. She had studied Marco's face for 2 years before she ever saw it in person. She knew every public photograph that existed, the handful of grainy images she had been able to connect to him through careful triangulation of financial records and meeting minutes, and the kind of peripheral documentation that accumulates around powerful people without ever directly naming them. She had built his profile the way her father had built his ledgers, slowly, methodically, with nothing left to assumption. Seeing him in person for the first time was like stepping off a curb she hadn't known was there. Her body dropped half an inch and caught itself. Marco Bellini was 61 years old and looked exactly like what he was, a man who had spent decades making himself appear harmless. He had the kind of face that people trusted, instinctively open and lined with something that read as grandfatherly warmth. He laughed easily. He touched people's arms when he talked to them. He had the politician's gift for making whoever he was speaking to feel like the most important person in the room. Clara had timed it perfectly. She turned her body to face the wall as they passed, angling the coffee tray to occupy the maximum amount of visual space between herself and the two men, becoming exactly what the space required her to be, a piece of the furniture, unremarkable and ignorable. They walked past without a glance. She held the tray steady. When they turned the corner, she allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of stillness, and then she kept walking. Inside, every nerve she had was on fire. He was real. He was here. And he was still at Damien's right hand. Over the following weeks, she shifted her attention. The financial evidence she had brought with her was compelling, but it was historical. Her father's work updated and expanded with everything she had gathered in the 4 years since. What she needed now was current. She needed to understand what Marco was doing now in this house, in this organization, in order to build a case that couldn't be dismissed or buried. She began to listen differently. Not eavesdropping, not obviously. But she had learned over years of practicing invisibility that people stop filtering themselves around the household staff with extraordinary consistency. It's not contempt exactly. It's something subtler, the same reflex that makes people have private conversations in taxis and waiting rooms. The comfortable assumption that the person within earshot is not truly present in the way that matters. Clara was always present. She cataloged names that came up in conversations she was never supposed to hear. She noted which rooms certain guards avoided when Marco was present. She paid attention to the way the security rotation changed on specific nights, subtle variations that wouldn't register to someone who hadn't memorized the baseline. And she found what she was looking for. Not all at once. In fragments, each one individually meaningless, collectively a pattern that made her stomach turn. There were two guardsmen named Caruso and Ferretti, who had been transferred into the estate's inner security rotation approximately 3 months before Clara arrived. Both had impeccable records. Both had been vetted through the organization's standard process. Both had, according to everything Clara could observe, the complete trust of the senior security staff. Both, she noticed, had different habits when Marco was in the building. They positioned themselves differently. Not in ways that would stand out to someone who wasn't watching for it. They were too skilled for obvious error, but different enough to catch Clara's attention once she was looking for it. They gave Marco wider berth than the other guards did. They mirrored his schedule without appearing to. When Marco moved through the house, Caruso and Ferretti always seemed to know it a few minutes before anyone else. She spent 3 weeks confirming the pattern before she allowed herself to believe it. And then she spent another week watching Damien, specifically watching the moments when he was with his security team, trying to determine whether he had noticed any of what she had noticed. He hadn't, which meant that whatever was coming, he was walking into it without knowing the ground had been prepared. The night it came together was a Thursday. Damien was hosting a private meeting with several of the organization's senior figures, a regular gathering that, according to house routine, always ended with Damien departing through the main entrance, escorted by his security detail, while the other men left through the garage exit. It was a routine so established that it had become invisible, which was Clara understood exactly the point. She was moving through the corridor outside the meeting room at the tail end of her shift, collecting the evening's service items, when she caught a fragment of conversation she wasn't supposed to hear. Two voices. Low. Not in the meeting room, but in the adjacent sitting room, the door barely ajar. Caruso's voice. The order is confirmed for tonight. Exit window is 3 minutes after the meeting closes. Ferretti has the position. A pause. And Bellini. He'll be in the clear before anyone understands what happened. The door of the sitting room was 2 feet from where Clara was standing. She didn't move for 4 full seconds. And in those 4 seconds, she ran through everything she knew. Everything she had spent years building, every fragment of evidence and observation that had led her to this house, this hallway, this exact moment. They were going to kill Damien tonight, not because Marco had given up on controlling the organization from the inside, but because something had changed, because the timeline had accelerated, because whatever Marco's endgame was tonight was the night he had decided to execute it. And Damien was going to walk through the front door and directly into it. She had in the moment approximately 90 seconds to decide what to do. Every rational calculation she had made over 4 years told her that her mission was the evidence. The documents, the financial trail, the proof that would expose Marco Bellini not just for what he was doing to the Vittorio organization, but for what he had done to her father. That was what she had come for. That was what mattered beyond any single night. But Damien Vittorio was about to die, and with him gone, Marco would take the organization. He would take everything her father had died trying to expose. He would bury it deeper, rebuild the layers around it, and this time, there would be no one left with the position or the power to dig it out. Everything she had built would die with Damien tonight. She folded the tray under her arm and turned back toward the meeting room. The moment she stepped through that door, she understood exactly how much she was risking. The room was heavy, with the kind of silence that exists between powerful men who have just concluded something important. Damien was standing at the head of the table, speaking quietly to one of the senior figure's jacket already straightened, ready to leave. 2 of his personal guards flanked the door she had just entered through. Every man in the room turned to look at her, including Marco Bellini, who was standing 3 feet to her left. She did not look at him. She looked directly at Damien Vittorio, and she spoke clearly enough to be heard across the full length of the table. "Mr. Vittorio, please leave through the back door." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence entirely. It was the silence of a room full of men who had just heard something so outside the boundaries of what was possible that their minds were still catching up to it. Damien's eyes moved to her face, not the dismissive glance of a powerful man acknowledging an intrusion before returning to what matters, something sharper than that, something that registered what he was seeing before he had decided what to make of it. "Who are you?" "Clara Bennett. I work in the household staff." "Mr. Vittorio, I need you to please leave through the back door. Right now, please." One of the guards moved toward her. "She shouldn't be in here." "Stop." Damien's voice was quiet. The guard stopped. "Why the back door?" She heard Marco shift behind her. She had perhaps 15 seconds before the calculation in the room turned against her in a way she couldn't recover from. "Because the exit is being watched," she said. "Not by people who work for you." The room changed. Not dramatically. Not the way it would in a movie with chairs scraping and hands reaching for weapons. It changed the way a room changes when a single true thing enters it quietly and completely. Damien looked at her for 3 more seconds. Then he said, "Everyone stay where they are." He walked to the side door, the interior door that connected to the back of the house, and he looked back at her once. "Come with me." The back corridor was narrow, and she had to walk quickly to keep pace with him. "Talk," he said. "2 guards named Caruso and Ferretti. They're not working for you tonight. I heard one of them confirm the order approximately 4 minutes ago. They have a 3-minute window after the meeting closes. The plan is for you to exit through the front, your standard route. Ferretti has a position. I don't know where exactly." Damien didn't break stride. "How do you know their names?" "I've been watching the security rotation for 6 weeks. Their positioning changes when a specific person is in the building. I noticed the pattern." "What person?" She hesitated. "1 second, too." "Marco Bellini." Damien stopped walking. She stopped half a step behind him, because she had been moving fast enough that she nearly walked into him, and for a moment they were both perfectly still in the narrow corridor. The distant sound of voices carrying through the walls from the meeting room they had just left. When he turned to look at her, his face was unreadable in a way that was more frightening than anger would have been. "Say that again." "Marco Bellini's schedule and the positioning of those 2 guards are connected. I've been watching it for 6 weeks. Tonight's the first time I've heard a direct confirmation." "You've been watching my security rotation for 6 weeks?" "Yes, sir." "Because you're a maid." "Because I'm someone who pays attention." Something moved across his face, not quite an expression, more like the suggestion of one, a flicker of something that is control almost but not entirely suppressed. "Keep moving," he said. They came out through the kitchen exit into the estate's rear courtyard, where a second vehicle was kept for contingency use. The driver was an older man named Gio, who had worked for Damien's father, and who Clara had observed was one of 3 people on the entire property who Damien appeared to trust, without visible reservation. Gio took one look at Damien's face and didn't ask any questions. Clara climbed into the back of the vehicle because Damien had not told her to do otherwise, and because every survival instinct she had was telling her that the moment she was separated from him tonight was the moment she lost the thread she had spent 4 years pulling. They moved through the estate's rear gate. Behind them, through the vehicle's back window, Clara could see the front entrance of the mansion lit against the night. Caruso and Ferretti, somewhere in its shadows, waiting for a man who was no longer coming. They drove for 20 minutes before anyone spoke. Damien was on a phone for the first 10, his voice so low she could only hear the cadence, not the words. He made 3 calls. On the 3rd call, she heard him say a name she didn't recognize, and a minute later, he ended the call and put the phone in his jacket pocket and looked at the back of Gio's head for a moment in silence. Then he turned to face her. "You said the plan was confirmed 4 minutes before you came into the room. That means you had time to call someone, or send a message, or leave through the servant's exit and let whatever was going to happen happen." "Yes." "Why didn't you—" Clara looked at him steadily. Because Marco Bellini was responsible for my father's disappearance. And if you die tonight, he wins. And I have spent 4 years making sure that doesn't happen." The sound of the car's engine filled the silence. Gio's eyes moved briefly to the rearview mirror and then back to the road. Damien didn't move, didn't blink, just watched her with that same unreadable quality she had seen in the corridor, the absolute stillness of a man who has trained himself not to react until he has understood everything there is to understand. "Your father," he said. "Robert Bennett. He was an accountant. He worked with people connected to this organization approximately 7 years ago. He discovered financial irregularities and tried to report them. He disappeared 6 years ago." "I don't know that name." "I know you don't. That's part of the problem." A long pause. "What do you know about Marco Bellini?" "More than anyone in that room behind us does, except Marco himself." Damien looked at her for another long moment. Then he said something she hadn't been prepared for. "Start at the beginning." She had rehearsed this conversation hundreds of times in the years before it happened. In the rehearsal version, she was controlled, strategic. She presented information with the precision of a legal argument building from evidence to conclusion without emotional interference. What actually happened was that she talked for 40 minutes straight, and her voice only broke twice, both times when she mentioned her father directly, and both times she recovered before the break became a sound. She told him about the envelope in the coat lining. She told him about the USB drives and the financial records and the 2 years of work it had taken her to understand what her father had documented. She told him about building the domestic worker profile, about the judge and his wife in Beacon Hill, about the 8 months it had taken to position herself inside the estate. She told him about 6 weeks of watching the security rotation, about Caruso and Ferretti, about the pattern that connected their movements to Marco's schedule. She pulled out her phone because she carried copies of everything, and she showed him the documentation, the ledger fragments, the shell company trails, the timeline her father had built, and the timeline she had extended. Damien studied her phone screen for a long time without speaking. When he finally looked up, he said, "How many people know any of this?" "No one, just me." "You've been sitting on evidence of treason inside my organization for 4 years. 6 weeks inside the estate, 4 years in preparation. And you told nobody. There was no one I could tell who wouldn't have made it disappear before it could matter." He handed her phone back to her. "Including me," he said. "It wasn't a question. I didn't know what you knew," she said carefully. "Or what you didn't know. I still don't completely. But you're alive tonight, which means the calculation has shifted." For the first time since she had walked into that meeting room, something in Damien's expression changed in a way that was unmistakably human. Not warm exactly, not grateful. Something more complicated than either of those things. "The woman who told me to leave through the back door," he said almost to himself, "spent 4 years building a case I didn't know needed to be built. My father spent his entire career around people with power. He understood how the systems work. He taught me. What happened to him?" And his voice was different when he said it, not softer exactly, but stripped of the calculation that had been in it before. "I don't know," Clara said. "That's the part I haven't been able to find. I know Marco Bellini was responsible. I know my father was trying to warn someone in this organization before he disappeared. I don't know what happened after that." The car was slowing. They had arrived somewhere, a secondary property, she guessed somewhere outside the estate's regular footprint. Damien looked at her one more time before the vehicle stopped. "You were going to do all of this alone," he said. "I didn't have another option." "You have one now." The night stretched long after that. Damien's security team, the trusted core of it, the 3 men he made his calls to from the car, converged on the secondary property within the hour. Clara sat in the corner of the room and watched Damien operate in the way you can only watch someone when they don't have any energy left to perform for anyone. He was methodical. He was cold in the precise way that cold is sometimes the only functional option. He made decisions, quickly changed two of them when new information came in, and didn't waste a single motion on anger or disbelief. He pulled up the security footage from the estate's front entrance, and they all watched Caruso and Ferretti spend 6 minutes at their positions after the meeting should have closed, waiting for someone who never came through the door. Watched them exchange a look. Watched them disappear into the shadow at the edge of the footage frame. "Caruso and Ferretti," Damien said to the room. "Find them, quietly." He turned to one of his men, Stefano, the one who had been with him the longest. "Run the Marco Bellini financial trace she gave me through your contacts. I want independent confirmation before morning." He turned to Clara. "Where's the original documentation, not the phone?" "Secure location, off-site. I'm going to need it." "I know. I'll give you the location once I know exactly what we're doing with it." A very brief pause. "Fair," he said. And that single word, its flatness, its lack of affront, the way it simply accepted her condition as a reasonable condition, told her more about what kind of man Damien Vittorio actually was than anything she had observed in 6 weeks of careful watching. It was past 3 in the morning when the room finally quieted. Stefano and the others had gone to work on their respective tasks. Gio was somewhere nearby. Damien was at the table with 3 separate documents spread in front of him, and Clara was standing at the window with a cup of coffee that had gone cold in her hands, looking at nothing. "You could have been wrong," Damien said from the table. Not an accusation, a statement. "Yes, you walked into that room in front of 6 men who would have had very unpleasant questions about why a maid was interrupting a private meeting, on a pattern you'd observed but not confirmed. I heard Caruso's voice confirm the order. That was enough. But if you'd been wrong about what it meant, I wasn't wrong." "No," he said. "You weren't." He was quiet for a moment. "Robert Bennett. You said he tried to warn someone in this organization before he disappeared." She turned from the window. "That's what I believe. The timing of his documentation suggests he was building toward a disclosure. The month before he disappeared, the financial irregularities he was tracking show a significant acceleration. I think Marco realized he was running out of time and moved to shut it down." "He would have come to my father," Damien said. The shift in his voice when he said it was so subtle she almost missed it. "That was my assumption." Damien set down the document he was holding. "My father died 4 years ago, the same year I took over the organization." He paused. "He died of a heart attack. That was the official account." Clara went very still. "But you've questioned it," she said. He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was perfectly even in the way that perfect evenness sometimes means exactly the opposite of what it sounds like. "There are things I started questioning," he said. "The first month after I took over. Things that didn't add up. Things that Marco Bellini had explanations for. Reasonable explanations. The kind of explanations you don't push on unless you're willing to accept what you might find. The night air was very quiet outside. And then you weren't willing to push," Clara said, and she said it without judgment because she understood it. She understood the weight of a truth so large that accepting it means accepting everything that comes with it, all the ways it changes everything you thought was solid. "I wasn't ready," he said. He picked the document back up. "I am now." By morning, 2 things had happened. Caruso had been located and was in custody of people who answered directly to Damien. Ferretti had not yet been found. Stefano had returned with his independent confirmation. The financial trail Clara had documented was real, was current, and extended in directions she hadn't yet traced, suggesting that what her father had uncovered 6 years ago was not the full scope of what Marco Bellini had built. The organization Clara had entered 6 weeks ago, invisibly carrying 4 years of evidence, and the memory of a father who had hummed folk songs over his kitchen table was different by morning than it had been the night before. And Clara Bennett, who had spent most of her adult life learning to be invisible, was sitting across a table from the head of the Vittorio family with her cold coffee and her phone full of documents, and she was the most visible person in the room. Damien looked at her across the table. "What do you need from me?" It was such a simple question. It was the question no one had asked her in 4 years. She wrapped both hands around the cold coffee cup and let herself feel for exactly 1 moment how tired she was. How long she had been carrying this. How many nights she had lain awake running calculations. How many hours she had spent being careful, being invisible, being exactly what the situation required, and nothing more. Then she set the cup down. "I need access to the internal financial records, the current ones. Marco has covered his tracks well, but not perfectly. There's always a seam. My father found it. I can find it again." Damien nodded once. "And I need to know," she said, and her voice stayed steady. "What happened to my father?" The morning light was coming through the window at a low angle. Damien Vittorio, who had built his life on the principle that trust was a weakness, looked at the woman across the table from him. The woman who had walked into a room full of powerful men and told him to use the back door. And he said, "We're going to find out. Both of us." Clara picked up the cold coffee and took a sip. She had been invisible for 4 years. She was done with invisible. The access Damien gave her was not unconditional. She understood that. She hadn't expected it to be. What he gave her the morning after the night that had changed everything was a room, a laptop connected to a restricted internal network, and a man named Stefano, who sat outside the door, not quite as a guard and not quite as a colleague, but somewhere in that exact uncomfortable middle space where trust hasn't yet decided what it's going to become. Damien himself was not there. He had things to handle that Clara understood would take most of the day, the internal fallout from what had happened the night before. The questions from the senior men who had been in that meeting room and who were now trying to understand what it meant that the organization's head had walked out through the back of the building without a word of explanation. Marco Bellini, according to Stefano's terse update at 8 in the morning, had expressed concern, had reached out twice to Damien's personal line, had, in Marco's words, heard something about an incident at the front entrance and wanted to make sure everything was all right. Clara was sitting at the laptop when Stefano told her that, and she made herself continue typing without any visible change in her expression, because every muscle in her body had gone tight, and she needed exactly 1 second to process what Marco reaching out meant before she could trust her face again. He didn't know how much Damien knew yet. That was what the call meant. He was testing. Probing the edges of the darkness to find out how much light had gotten in. "What did Damien tell him?" she asked. "That there was a security issue at the perimeter. Nothing more." "Good," she said. "That buys us time." Stefano looked at her from the doorway with an expression that was somewhere between skeptical and reluctant. "You know he's going to push for a meeting," Stefano said. "Marco. He always pushes for a meeting when he doesn't have information. It's how he operates." Clara looked up from the screen. "I know. That's actually useful." "How is that useful?" "Because a man who's asking questions doesn't know what's been found. The moment Marco stops asking and starts acting is when we have a real problem." She paused. "How long have you worked for Damien?" Stefano considered this as if deciding whether to answer. 11 years. "Have you ever seen him wrong about a person?" A longer pause. "Once," Stefano said. "Who?" He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, "Marco Bellini," and went back to standing outside the door. The internal financial records were more organized than she had expected and more encrypted than she had hoped. Whoever had built the organization's accounting architecture had done it well, layered, compartmentalized, with legitimate business operations, woven so thoroughly through the criminal ones that separating them required the kind of methodical patience that most people Clara had learned simply didn't have. Her father had had it. She had inherited it. She started where her father had stopped because that was the only logical place. She had memorized the end point of his documentation, the final entry on the 3rd USB drive, dated 11 days before his disappearance. A fragmentary notation about a specific transaction that didn't reconcile with 3 months of prior entries. It was incomplete. It was the kind of note a man leaves when he expects to come back and finish his thought when he doesn't yet know he won't have the chance. She found the transaction within 2 hours. It had been altered. Not deleted. Deletion leaves absence, and absence is its own kind of evidence. It had been altered in a way that required understanding both the original structure and the cover layer, the way a painting can be restored to reveal a different painting underneath. Someone had gone into the records after her father's notation and changed the destination coding on a series of payments, redirecting them through a legitimate real estate transaction that would make them invisible to a standard audit. The alteration was skilled. It was not perfect. Her father had taught her when someone changes a record, they change the record. They don't change the logic that should have generated it. The underlying arithmetic still exists. You just have to know where the logic would have taken you if the record hadn't been touched. She followed the logic. By noon, she had found the seam. By 2 in the afternoon, she had pulled 12 threads through it, each one connecting to a different layer of what Marco had built over the course of not 2 years, not 3, but 11. 11 years of systematic, patient, extraordinary theft money that should have moved through the Vittorio organization, redirected so gradually, so carefully, that the cumulative amount was only visible when you looked at the full picture. She sat back from the screen and stared at the number she had written down. Then she picked up the paper and went to find Stefano. "I need Damien," she said. Stefano looked at the paper she was holding. He couldn't read the number from where he was standing, but something in her face made him straighten. "He's in a call." "I know. This can't wait." Damien took one look at her face when she came into the room and ended his call without explanation. She put the paper on the table in front of him. He looked at the number for a long time. "That's what he's taken," she said. "Conservative estimate. The full picture is probably larger. I've only traced the portion I can directly connect to the records I have access to." Damien didn't say anything immediately. In the silence, Clara watched him do something she had only seen him do once before, in the car, the night before. The thing that wasn't quite an expression, that existed at the very edge of the control he kept over everything his face did. Something moving underneath the surface that his discipline was working to contain. 11 years, he said, since the second year of your father's leadership. Possibly earlier. I can't confirm anything before the records I have access to. But the pattern starts 11 years ago. Before I took over. He was building it under your father, and then your father died. The word "died" settled into the room with its full weight. Damien looked at the number on the paper for another 3 seconds. Then he looked up at her. "You said last night you believed Marco moved to silence your father because the timeline was accelerating, that he was running out of time." "Yes." "What if your father wasn't the reason the timeline accelerated?" She went very still. "What do you mean? What if your father found the evidence? He tried to bring it to my father, and my father listened." Damien's voice was completely flat now, the flatness of a man talking about the thing he has been circling for 4 years without ever letting himself land on it. "What if my father already knew, or was starting to know, and Marco found out that he knew?" Clara looked at him. The heart attack. 4 years ago. The same year Damien took over. "You're saying..." "I'm saying the timing of my father's death has bothered me for 4 years, and I have never had enough information to take that thought anywhere." He stood up from the table. "Until now." The room felt very quiet. "Damien." She said his name without planning to, and he stopped. "If that's true, if Marco killed your father, then what happened to my father was worse than I thought. He didn't just discover the financial fraud. He walked into something much larger, and he was eliminated to protect it." "Yes." "And Marco has been sitting in this organization for 4 years since your father died, completely trusted and completely in control of what anyone looking into this would find." "Yes." "Then we can't move on any of this until we have the full picture. If we move too early, he buries it. He has the contacts, he has the history, he has the trust of people in this organization who have known him for decades. If we expose him before we have everything, he survives it." Damien looked at her with an intensity she felt physically. How long? A week, maybe 10 days. I need to trace the rest of the threads, and I need something I don't have yet, a direct financial connection between Marco and the two guards. Something that places him outside the organization's books. That connection exists, Damien said. If he used Caruso and Ferretti, he paid them from somewhere. Find the somewhere. I'm already looking, but Damien... She hesitated. To find it, I need to go back inside the estate. The silence stretched. Marco will be there, Damien said. I know. He'll be looking for anything unusual. Which is exactly why you need to send me back. If I disappear from the staff overnight, that's unusual. I've worked there for 6 weeks without anything to indicate I'm anything other than what I appear to be. If I go back and I do my job and I'm invisible, Marco has no reason to look at me. Damien studied her for a long moment. And if he already knows you're the one who warned me, then I need to know that before you do, because knowing when Marco suspects something is as important as knowing what he knows. It was the kind of answer she understood that could go two ways. It could sound like the logic of someone who understood strategy, or it could sound like something much more reckless than strategy. Damien turned away from her briefly and looked at the opposite wall for 4 seconds. Then he turned back. You go back at 7 a.m. tomorrow, standard shift. You report to Stefano by noon and again at 5 p.m. If anything changes, you get out immediately. You don't negotiate with changed circumstances. Understood. Clara. She stopped. Marco Bellini has been in this organization for 31 years. He has had people removed who were much less of a threat to him than you are right now. He said it evenly, not as a threat, not as a warning designed to frighten her out of going. He said it the way you tell someone the truth about what they're walking into when you respect them enough not to soften it. I need you to understand exactly what that means. I understand it, she said. I've understood it since I found my father's note. He held her gaze for a moment longer. 7 a.m., he said. She was back at the estate by 6:58. The servant's entrance was the same. The kitchen smelled the same coffee and cleaning solution, and the particular staleness of a large building that has been closed up overnight. The morning staff was beginning their routines, and Clara moved into her own routine with the mechanical fluency of 6 weeks of practice, collecting her cart, beginning her floor assignment, and watching everything. The estate felt different. She couldn't have named exactly why, to someone who wasn't paying the kind of attention she was. Nothing visible had changed. The furniture was where it had been. The morning light came through the same windows at the same angle. The other staff moved through their work with their usual quiet efficiency. But there was a frequency in the air, a vibration just below the threshold of sound, the way a building feels after something has moved through it. Marco Bellini arrived at 9:15. Clara was in the upstairs hallway when she heard his voice below, carrying the particular easy warmth that was so natural on him it was almost impossible not to respond to. She heard one of the junior staff laugh at something he said. She heard him ask about someone's mother, use a first name, express genuine-sounding interest in the answer. She kept moving, kept her pace exactly what it always was, kept her face arranged in exactly the expression it always wore in the upstairs hallway, attentive to the work present, enough to be competent, absent enough to be invisible. Invisible. She had spent her life learning to be invisible. She had never hated it until now. She found the first thread she needed at 11:43 a.m. She had been working through the second floor's administrative wing, the offices that supported the estate's legitimate business operations, and she had been assigned to cleaning the small supply room adjacent to the main office because one of the other staff had called in sick. The supply room had a network connection panel on the east wall, an infrastructure access point that the estate's tech team used for maintenance, and that according to what she had observed in 6 weeks, nobody else thought about. Clara thought about everything. She had a device in her cleaning cart. A thumb drive no larger than a fingernail encrypted, purchased 4 years ago, for a moment exactly like this one, and she spent 45 seconds connected to the panel before she heard footsteps in the corridor, and disconnected and went back to restocking the supply shelves, with her heart moving at a pace that she controlled through breathing and sheer familiar practice. The footsteps passed. She finished restocking the shelves and pushed her cart out into the corridor and kept moving. At noon, she called Stefano. "I have something. Tell Damien to have the technical person he trusts look at what I'm sending tonight." "What kind of something?" "The kind that connects the estate's internal communication records to 3 external numbers I haven't traced yet. It's a starting point." "You were only inside the network for 45 seconds is enough if you know exactly what you're pulling." A brief pause. "Damien said noon and 5, Stefano said. "I know. Noon report done. I'll call at 5. She ended the call and went back to work. The thing about Marco Bellini was that he was genuinely good at what he did. Clara had understood this intellectually for 2 years, since long before she entered the estate. The financial manipulation she had traced required not just intelligence, but patience, and the kind of patience that doesn't feel like patience. From the inside, it feels like certainty. The certainty that you can see further than everyone else in the room, and that this advantage will remain yours indefinitely, as long as you never become careless. Marco had not been careless, but Clara had spent the morning pulling at the threads she could reach, and by 2 in the afternoon, she had begun to see the shape of something her father had not been able to find, because her father hadn't had the access she had, and because the specific layer she was now tracing was one that Marco had built after her father was gone, with the additional confidence of a man who believed the most dangerous witness to his operation had been permanently silenced. The external numbers she had pulled from the network panel traced back to 3 separate communication nodes. She wouldn't be able to run the trace herself. She needed Damien's technical contact for that. But she had cross-referenced them against the payment records she had already mapped, and the timing of the communications correlated precisely with 3 significant transactions in the months before last night. Before the night, Marco had decided to move against Damien directly. That decision hadn't been spontaneous. She had already known that much. The positioning of Caruso and Ferretti, the months of careful preparation, this had been planned for a long time. But the communications timing suggested something more specific, a pressure point. Something that had forced Marco to accelerate his timeline. What had changed 3 months ago? She was still turning that question over when she rounded the corner on the 2nd floor at 2:47 and walked directly into Marco Bellini. They were alone in the corridor. He was coming out of the east study. She was coming from the linen closet with her cart. They nearly collided, and Marco stepped back with the easy grace of a man who is comfortable in any situation, and he smiled at her. "My apologies," he said. "Not at all, sir. My fault." Eyes down. Cart angled. Everything exactly as it always was. She had taken 2 steps past him when he spoke again. "You're Clara, aren't you?" She stopped. She turned slowly with exactly the amount of mild surprise that someone in her position would feel at being addressed by name by someone at his level. "Yes, sir." He was looking at her with an expression that was friendly and warm and absolutely unreadable underneath. "I make it a point to know the people working in this house," he said. "You came about 6 weeks ago." 7 weeks next Monday, sir. You came from the Harmon placement. Richard Harmon, the judge. He had done his research. The question was when. "That's right. I worked for Judge Harmon for about 4 months. He's a careful man. He doesn't recommend people he doesn't trust." Marco smiled again, and it was such a genuinely warm smile that Clara felt the visceral wrongness of it in a way that was almost physical, the smile of someone who has practiced warmth so thoroughly it has become indistinguishable from the real thing. "You must be good at your work." "I try to be, sir." "I'm sure you do." He looked at her for exactly 1 second longer than the conversation required. "Well, don't let me keep you." He moved past her toward the staircase, and Clara turned back to her cart and pushed it down the corridor, and she did not speed up, did not change her pace, did not allow any part of her body to communicate anything other than a maid returning to her work. She reached the end of the corridor and turned the corner. And then, for 3 precise seconds, she let herself acknowledge how close that had been. He knew her name. He knew her placement history. He had gone looking. The question was why and when, and what it meant that he had come looking before or after last night. She pulled out her phone and typed a single message to Stefano. Marco knows my name and placement history. Need to assess timeline of when he researched it. Does not appear to know more yet. Staying on schedule. She put the phone away. She kept moving. Damien's response came through Stefano 40 minutes later. Technical contact confirms 2 of the 3 external numbers connect to shell entities matching the pattern in your documentation. Third number unconfirmed but tied to a location in Miami. We need to talk tonight. Gio will be at the East Gate at 6. She read it twice and deleted it. At 5 o'clock, she called Stefano with her second report. Marco initiated a meeting with Damien for tomorrow morning. Stefano said before she could speak. First thing, Marco is framing it as a concern about last night. Wants to discuss security vulnerabilities. Of course he does. Damien is going to take the meeting. He has to. If he refuses, Marco knows something has changed. She paused. Stefano, how many people in the organization's senior circle have regular access to the estate's communication infrastructure? Not the tech team. The principals. A pause. 2. Maybe 3. Why? Because whoever pressured Marco's timeline 3 months ago used that infrastructure to communicate with him. That narrows considerably who could have been the pressure point. You're saying someone else was squeezing Marco? I'm saying Marco has been running this operation for 11 years, and he was careful enough to not need to move against Damien directly until 3 months ago. Something changed. Something changed or someone threatened to change it. I need to know what happened in this organization 3 months ago. Silence on the line. Then Stefano said slowly, 3 months ago Damien started a review. What kind of review? Financial, the legitimate business side. He said it was a routine restructuring. Nobody thought anything of it. She understood immediately. The review would have involved auditing the real estate holdings, she said. Yes. And the real estate holdings are exactly where Marco's hidden the money. Clara, Marco didn't accelerate his timeline because he got impatient, she said. He accelerated it because Damien was about to find it on his own. The review was going to expose everything, so Marco decided to eliminate the threat before it could reach him. The full shape of it came together in her mind in the space of 5 seconds, 11 years of careful theft. One financial review that threatened to unravel it. A decision made in desperation rather than certainty. Damien needs to know this tonight, she said. He'll be at the East Gate. She was at the gate at 6 on the dot. Gio drove. Damien was in the back, and he listened to everything she had found without interrupting the communication records, the timeline of the financial review, the logic of why Marco had been forced to move when he did. When she finished, Damien was quiet for a moment. He's been watching the review, Damien said. He would have had someone inside the accounting team tracking its progress. When it got close enough, he moved, Clara confirmed. That's why the preparation with Caruso and Ferretti was rushed relative to everything else he'd done. 11 years of careful construction, and then 3 months to execute the exit plan. He made mistakes he wouldn't have made if he'd had more time. What mistakes? The communication pattern. He used infrastructure he'd used before, which means the records go back. And Caruso and Ferretti, they're connected to a payment source that traces back to the shell entities, which means the financial link to Marco is there. It's not clean enough. Damien looked at her in the low light. How close are you? 2 days, maybe 3. I need access to the estate's historical communication logs and the full accounting of the real estate transactions from the past 11 years. I have the ledger logic to decrypt what I find, but I need the records. I can get you the communication logs. The real estate records are held by an outside firm, Marchetti Group. Do you trust anyone at Marchetti? The principal. Paul Marchetti has handled the family's legitimate holdings for 20 years. He's not part of any of this. Can you get me access without Marco knowing the request came from you? Damien thought about this. Paul can route it as a routine audit preparation. He owes me a favor I've never called in. He paused. I'll call him tonight. And tomorrow's meeting with Marco. I'll handle it. Damien. She waited until he looked at her. He's going to be reading everything you say tomorrow. Everything you don't say. Every shift in how you hold yourself. He's been watching you for 4 years. He knows your baseline. If anything is different, he'll know something is different. I know. I'm not telling you how to behave in a conversation. I'm telling you he's very good at this. So am I, Damien said. And something in his voice, not arrogance. Something older and quieter than arrogance. The voice of a man who has had to be good at exactly this kind of thing for his entire adult life made her believe it. I know you are, she said. Marco arrived for the meeting at 8 the next morning with a box of pastries from the bakery, 3 blocks from his apartment, the kind of small personal gesture he had been making for 30 years. The accumulated warmth of a man who understood that trust is built in the smallest moments. Clara was on the main floor when he arrived. She kept her eyes where they always were and moved at her usual pace and logged every detail of Marco's body language with the part of her attention that never stopped working. He was composed, immaculate. He greeted 2 of the kitchen staff by name, asked about a third who wasn't there. He moved through the house with the ease of a man who has spent decades making himself belong to a place. But his right hand, Clara noticed, opened and closed once when he thought no one was watching. He was afraid, not visibly, not in any way anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it would see. But he was afraid, and the pastry box and the easy smiles and the first-name greetings were doing precisely the work they were designed to do, covering the frequency of a man who had spent the night recalculating. She had 2 days to finish what she was building. She needed Marco to spend those 2 days believing he was still in control of what happened next. She pushed her cart toward the east wing and kept moving. The meeting between Damien and Marco lasted 47 minutes. Stefano gave her the summary at noon. Marco expressed concern about the security failure, suggested a full review of the exterior perimeter team, offered to oversee the review personally. Of course he did. Damien agreed, told Marco the review should start with the guard rotation changes from the past 6 months. Clara stopped. He said that, word for word. She processed this for 3 seconds. That's brilliant, she said quietly. If Marco overseeing that review, he'll have to either expose his own connection to Caruso and Ferretti or manufacture a clean explanation for their presence. Either way, he has to handle records that he thought were safely buried. Damien said you'd understand why, Stefano said. She leaned against the wall of the corridor with her cart beside her and allowed herself precisely 5 seconds of something that felt uncomfortably close to relief, the relief of not being alone in this, of working alongside someone whose mind moved at the same speed and in the same directions as her own. The Marchetti records, she asked. Being prepared. Paul Marchetti is routing them as standard audit preparation. You'll have them tonight. I'll need 4 hours with them. Damien said to take what you need. She straightened up, picked up the cart handle. Stefano. Yes. Has Ferretti been found? A brief pause. Not yet. That was the piece that still worried her most. Caruso was contained. But Ferretti was loose, and Ferretti had been positioned at the front of the estate the night everything changed, which meant Ferretti knew exactly how close the plan had come to succeeding and exactly how far it had fallen short. And a man in Ferretti's position, uncontained, and knowing what he knew was the variable she couldn't calculate for. Tell Damien I need to know the moment Ferretti surfaces, she said. That's not a preference. That's a requirement. Understood. She ended the call and looked at the corridor in front of her, long and empty and exactly what it had always been. And she thought about her father, standing in a hallway like this one, 6 years ago, knowing what he knew, trying to figure out how to carry it forward. She understood him better now than she ever had. She understood the weight of knowing the truth, when the truth is dangerous, when the truth belongs to a system designed to protect itself, when the only way forward requires accepting that there is no safe path, only the one you take. Her father had taken it. She was taking it. She picked up the cart and kept moving. The Marchetti records arrived at 10 that night. She worked through them with the focused intensity of someone who has been waiting for a specific thing and finally has it in their hands. The real estate holdings were on the surface exactly what any substantial criminal organization's legitimate property portfolio would look like, a mix of commercial and residential managed, conservatively generating income at a rate consistent with the market. Underneath the surface was the architecture her father had partially described in his documentation. 11 years of redirected payments. Each one individually explicable. Each one connected when you stood far enough back to a single pattern of deliberate accumulative theft. Money flowing through property transactions and back out through shell entities to accounts she now had enough information to connect directly to Marco Bellini's personal financial network. She finished the trace at 2:15 in the morning. She sat back from the screen. The full number was larger than the estimate she had given Damien the day before. Significantly larger. She stared at it for a moment. Then she looked at the final entry in the trail, the most recent transaction dated 11 days before the night she had stepped into that meeting room and told Damien to use the back door. It was a payment. Large, specific, routed through the Miami-connected entity Damien's technical contact had flagged. She cross-referenced the amount against everything she had. And then she understood what she was looking at. This wasn't just theft. This wasn't Marco building a personal fortune on the side of an organization that employed him. This was a purchase, a final transaction before everything changed. Money moving to a destination that, if she was reading this correctly, represented Marco's exit. The money he had spent securing a position that would protect him after the organization was no longer his platform. He had been planning to disappear, not to take over the Vittorio organization after Damien's death, to take the money and vanish. Everything she had assumed about Marco's endgame was wrong. He wasn't trying to become the head of the family. He was trying to get out with everything he had taken, protected by whatever he had purchased with that final transaction, leaving behind an organization in chaos with no clear path to finding him. Killing Damien wasn't a power play. It was a cover story. Buy time. Create enough confusion and grief and organizational disruption that by the time anyone started looking at the financial records, Marco Bellini would be somewhere with a different name and no connection to anything that could reach him. She reached for her phone. It was 2:17 in the morning. She called Damien anyway. He picked up on the second ring, and the fact that he answered that fast at that hour told her he had been awake. "Tell me," he said. She told him. The silence on the other end of the line lasted 4 full seconds. "He was going to run," Damien said. "He was going to run. The money is already positioned. The exit is already arranged, which means he's not going to wait much longer." "How long do you think we have?" Clara looked at the final transaction date on the screen. "I think we had more time before tonight. Now that I've seen the full picture." She paused, running the calculation. "He's been waiting for the right moment since the assassination attempt failed. He's evaluating his exposure. When he decides his exposure is critical, he moves. What would make him decide? One of two things. Either he finds out how much we know, or enough time passes that he calculates the risk of waiting has exceeded the risk of running. How long until the second threshold? A week, maybe less. And the first. The moment he realizes his communication records are compromised. The moment he understands someone has connected him to the payment trail. The moment he suspects I'm more than a maid. In the quiet on the line, she could hear him thinking. "Clara," Damien said, "I need to ask you something directly." "Go ahead." "The documentation, you have all of it. Everything you've built over 4 years, plus what you've found in the last 2 days. If we moved on this right now, tonight with what we have, is it enough?" She thought about it honestly. "It's enough to destroy him financially. It's enough to expose the fraud and the shell network. It's enough to connect him to the planning of the assassination attempt. She paused. But I don't have the direct evidence of what happened to my father, or yours. The silence stretched. Then we have until the end of the week, Damien said. Find the rest of it. And if Marco moves before the end of the week, then we use what we have and accept what we can't prove. His voice was steady. But I don't think he moves before the end of the week, because he doesn't know what we know. And a man who thinks he still has time acts like he has time. He's very careful. So are you, Damien said. You've been in his house for 7 weeks and he still thinks you clean floors. She almost laughed. Almost. Get some sleep, he said. You have 2 more days. She looked at the screen in front of her, at 11 years of patience and theft laid out in the cold logic of numbers, at the shape of a man's life and choices rendered in financial architecture. Damien? Yes. When this is over... She stopped. Reconsidered. When this is over, I want to know what happened to my father. Not the evidence version. The real version. Whatever you find. A pause. You'll know, he said. She believed him. She closed the laptop, and in the dark of the room she sat quietly for a moment, with everything she knew and everything she still needed, and the 4 years of waiting that had finally become something she could see the end of. And then she went to get a few hours of sleep. Because tomorrow she was going back into that house. And Marco Bellini still thought she was just a maid. She went back into the estate the next morning carrying everything she knew like a stone she had agreed to swallow. The weight of it was different now. Before she had carried the knowledge of what Marco had done as a case to be built, evidence to be assembled, a problem with a methodology attached to it. Now she carried the knowledge of what Marco was planning to do, and that was a different kind of weight, entirely the weight of a clock she could hear but not see ticking toward. A moment she could estimate but not pinpoint. He was going to run. Everything she had found in the Marchetti records pointed to a man in the final stages of an exit that had been years in preparation. The money was positioned. The destination was arranged. What Marco was doing now inside this house with his pastry boxes and his first-name greetings and his warm handshakes and his offer to personally oversee the security review. All of it was the performance of a man who needed 4 more days of normal before he disappeared forever. Clara understood performers. She had been performing for 7 weeks. The difference between them, she thought as she pushed her cart down the main corridor at 7:15 in the morning, was that her performance was built on a truth she was trying to protect. His was built on a lie he was trying to sustain long enough to escape. And this morning, she was going to find the part he thought no one would ever find. Stefano had passed her a location the night before. 1 sentence, no context. Basement archive. East Wing. Filing system pre-2015. Damien says you'll know what you're looking for. She had read it 3 times before she understood what Damien was telling her. The basement archive was where the organization kept its oldest records, pre-digital, pre-restructuring the physical documentation of an era before the family had sophisticated financial infrastructure. Most of it was ordinary, the kind of accumulated paperwork that large organizations generate, and nobody ever fully sorts through. It had never been digitized because no one had considered it relevant enough to justify the cost. But if her father had brought physical documentation to the elder Vittorio, if Robert Bennett, careful and methodical as he always was, had carried paper copies of what he had found, then the basement archive was exactly where those copies might still be. Not because anyone had deliberately preserved them, because no one had looked. She got into the basement archive at 10:47 during the window when the East Wing was between its morning and midday cycles and the foot traffic was at its lowest. The room was lined with shelves from floor to ceiling, 40 years of accumulated organizational memory, filed in the careful system of a secretary, long retired, and preserved by institutional inertia. Clara moved through it methodically, not rushing, keeping her movements indistinguishable from routine cleaning, in case anyone glanced in. She found what she was looking for in the third row, sixth shelf from the bottom. A manila folder with nothing written on the outside. Filed between two quarterly reports from 14 years ago, invisible precisely because it was exactly the kind of thing that belongs in a room like this, and therefore disappears into it. She opened it. Her father's handwriting. Not the small precise script of his hidden note. This was his working handwriting. The handwriting she knew from grocery lists and birthday cards, and the margins of books he had been reading, slightly rushed. Confident, the marks of a man who was thinking faster than his pen. 12 pages. Dated 6 years ago. The month before he disappeared. She stood in the basement archive and read every word. Her father had not only documented the financial fraud, he had gone further than she had known, further than she had been able to trace from the external records. He had found a second layer, something Marco had built underneath the financial network, a set of arrangements with people outside the organization who were being paid to provide protection and interference if anyone ever got too close. People in positions of authority. The kind of positions that explain why a missing persons case goes cold in 3 months and stays cold. He had found the names. She photographed every page with her phone fast and precise, and replaced the folder in exactly the position she had found it. And then she read the last page. It was a letter, addressed to no one, written in a hand that was slightly less steady than the previous 11 pages, dated 2 days before his disappearance. I am going to take this to Vincent Vittorio in person. I don't trust any channel that can be intercepted. I believe Vincent is a man who will act on this if he knows. I'm leaving copies here and at home in case something goes wrong before I reach him. If something happens, please find Damien. He's the one who comes after. He needs to know who Marco Bellini really is. She stared at the last line. He needs to know who Marco Bellini really is. Her father had written that sentence. Her father, who had spent his final weeks documenting the truth about a man who was trusted completely by an entire family, had sat in this building, had walked through these halls, had found this room or one like it, and had written those words with the knowledge that he might not be the one to deliver them. He had trusted her to deliver them. Even without knowing she existed yet, without knowing what form his successor would take, he had trusted that someone would find this and carry it forward. She thought about her mother sitting in the hallway, shrinking away from the world. She thought about the coat in the closet, and the envelope in the lining, and the folk song that was a password. She put her phone in her pocket. She picked up her cart. She had 4 hours before her noon report to Stefano, and she had just fundamentally changed the shape of the case. She called Damien directly, not Stefano. The first time she had called him directly since the 2 a.m. conversation about the Marchetti records. He picked up before the second ring. Your father came to this house, she said. He found your father in person. He brought documentation, physical copies. I have photographs of all 12 pages. He believed Vincent would act on it. The silence on the other end of the line was very particular. The silence of a man absorbing something he had been circling for 4 years without being able to land on it. He reached him, Damien said. It wasn't a question. It was a man completing a sentence he had started a long time ago. I believe so, Clara said carefully. Your father died 4 weeks after the date on my father's letter. 4 weeks. Damien's voice was completely even. The complete evenness of a man in absolute control of something. He is not going to let break through the surface right now, in this moment, in this phone call, because breaking through the surface is a luxury that does not exist yet. Marco knew my father had been told. And Marco knew your father well enough to know that Vincent would act. He had weeks, maybe less, before Vincent moved against him. So he acted first. My father's heart attack. Yes. The word landed between them and stayed there. Clara. His voice had dropped a register, not in volume, but in something underneath the volume, something that had nothing to do with strategy or calculation. Your father walked into this house and died trying to save my father. He walked in and did what he came to do, she said. He got the information to your father. It's not his fault what happened next. No. A pause. But it's mine. Damien. I took over this organization after my father died, and I kept Marco at my right hand for 4 years because the alternative required me to accept something I wasn't ready to accept. Every day of those 4 years, I chose not to look. He stopped. Your father looked. At significant personal cost, he looked. And stop. She said it with enough firmness that he did. You didn't have what he had. You had a feeling and no evidence, and a man who had spent 30 years making himself indispensable to your family. That's not the same as refusing to look. That's being in a position where looking required something almost impossible. She paused. I didn't come here to assign blame. I came here to finish what my father started. A long silence. Send me the photographs, he said. Already sent to Stefano's encrypted line. Of course you did. The ghost of something in his voice, not quite a laugh, but the space where a laugh might eventually exist, and it was so unexpected that she had to actively not respond to it. I need one more day inside the house, she said. There's something in the communication records I haven't closed yet. The third external number, the one in Miami. I need to connect it to a name. You'll have it. And Damien. The morning meeting tomorrow, with Marco. What about it? He's going to ask you something. I don't know what exactly, but he's calculating his own timeline right now the same way we are. He's going to use that meeting to take one more reading of where you are, how much you know, whether he has more time or less. I know. Whatever he asks, answer slowly. 1 beat longer than you normally would. Not enough to signal hesitation. Just enough to make him feel like he's getting the real answer. A pause. Why? Because a man like Marco reads confidence as a threat and uncertainty as an opportunity. If he believes he still has a window, he'll use it. And a Marco who believes he has a window is a Marco who stays put. You want him to think he has more time than he does. I want him to think you're still in the dark, confused about last night, trusting the wrong people to help you figure it out. She paused. He needs to believe he's the smartest person in this situation for 48 more hours. And then he won't be, Clara said. Duh. She was on her third sweep of the administrative wing at 2 in the afternoon when she felt the shift. She had learned to trust this feeling, this particular frequency of wrongness, that her body registered before her conscious mind caught up to it. It was the same feeling she had gotten in the corridor outside the sitting room when she heard Caruso's voice. The same feeling she had gotten when Marco said her name for the first time. Something was different in the house. She couldn't locate it immediately. The wing was quiet staff moving through their afternoon routines, nothing visibly altered. She kept her pace and kept her senses wide open and let her attention move around the space like water finding the places where the surface was disturbed. She found it in the way 2 of the senior household staff were talking in low voices near the east staircase. Not urgently, nothing that would flag from a distance. But their conversation had the particular body language of people communicating something they're not supposed to be communicating in this location at this time. She came close enough to hear 2 words before they noticed her and stopped. Ferretti called. She kept walking, kept the cart moving at its precise regular pace, did not alter her breathing. Ferretti had surfaced, and he hadn't surfaced to Damien. She was at the east gate at 3:45 instead of 6. Gio wasn't supposed to be there until 6, but he was there at 3:45 because she had sent 3 words to Stefano the moment she was out of the east wing, and Stefano had made a call. Damien was already in the car. She got in. Ferretti called someone inside the estate, she said before the door was fully closed. I caught the tail end of a conversation near the east staircase. 2 of the household staff. I don't know who he called or what was said, but the connection exists. He's communicating with people inside. Which staff members? I couldn't see faces. I only caught 2 words, and then they saw me and stopped. She paused. But Damien, if Ferretti is communicating with people inside the house, it's because Marco set that up as a contingency. A secondary communication channel in case the primary operation failed. He planned for the plan failing? Damien said. He planned for everything. He's had 11 years to plan for everything. She looked at him. If Ferretti reports back to Marco that someone overheard even a fragment of that conversation, our timeline compresses dramatically. How dramatically? We may not have until the end of the week. Damien looked out the window for exactly 3 seconds. What do you need? The third Miami number. I need the name tonight. Everything else is in place. The financial trail, the communication records, the documentation from the archive. But the Miami connection is his exit. If I can name it, I can use it. I can give you the ability to close that door before he walks through it. Paul Marchetti has contacts in Miami, Damien said. Property connections. He may be able to cross-reference the entity against his network. Call him now. Damien looked at her. Please, she added. He pulled out his phone. Paul Marchetti was 63 years old and had spent 4 decades managing the legitimate side of the Vittorio family's financial life, with the carefully maintained neutrality of a man who understands exactly where his knowledge ends and where it's wise to ensure it stays ended. He loved the elder Vincent Vittorio, in the particular way that men of a certain era and sensibility love people who treat them with consistent respect, and he had transferred a careful portion of that love to Damien, who was different from his father in many ways, but preserved the quality of respect that mattered most. When Damien called him at 4 p.m. and said he needed a name attached to a Miami-based shell entity by that evening, Paul Marchetti asked exactly 2 questions. Is this for protection of the family? Yes. How soon is the danger? Possibly hours, certainly days. I'll call you back in 40 minutes. Paul Marchetti said. And he ended the call. Clara counted the minutes. Paul called back in 37. The name he gave them was not a corporation. It was not a property management entity. It was not any of the things Clara had been imagining in the space between the call and the callback. It was a man. A former federal prosecutor named William Reyes, who had resigned from the Justice Department 8 years ago under circumstances that had never been fully public, and who now ran a private legal consultancy in Miami with a client list that nobody had ever managed to obtain in full. Clara stared at Damien. He purchased protection from a former federal prosecutor, she said. More than protection, Damien said. He understood it immediately the same way she did. Reyes would have had access to federal investigation records, case files, the names of people inside law enforcement who were looking at the Vittorio organization. Marco would have been buying information advance warning about anything moving against him, and the ability to influence any investigation before it reached him. For 11 years. Which means every federal interest in this organization over the past decade has been filtered through William Reyes before it reached us, Damien said. Marco didn't just steal money. He compromised our legal exposure. He sold us out to a man who was selling us back information we were paying him to obtain about ourselves. The full shape of it was breathtaking in its audacity. Breathtaking and nauseating simultaneously. We can use this, Clara said. Reyes is his most exposed connection. The payment trail to Miami is the cleanest line we have. If we can connect Reyes to the specific information he passed to Marco, we have evidence of a federal compromise, which means the legal exposure goes both ways, Damien said. Marco can be pursued on grounds that go well beyond what happens inside this organization. It also means, Clara said carefully, that whatever Reyes has on your organization, whatever case information he's been filtering, you need to understand what that is before you move. Damien looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. You're protecting me, he said. I'm protecting the case, she said. If we move on Marco and his first response is to weaponize what Reyes knows about this organization, we need to be ready for that. And if I'm not ready for that, then we need to make you ready. Whatever Reyes has, it's leverage. Marco will use it if he thinks it can save him. She paused. What's your current legal exposure? Honestly. The question sat in the car between them. Significant on some fronts, Damien said. Manageable on others. Then we need a controlled burn, she said. You acknowledge what can be acknowledged before Marco forces it into the open. You take away his leverage. That's not a small thing. No, she said. It's not. But it's smaller than what happens if Marco runs and burns everything down on his way out. Damien was quiet for a long moment. I need to speak to my own legal people tonight, he said. Do it carefully. Marco has connections that go deep. Be certain who you're speaking to. I've been certain about 3 people in this organization since last Thursday, Damien said. Gio, Stefano, and you. She met his eyes. That's enough, she said. Those 3 can be enough. The night was long. Damien spent 3 hours with his lawyers, 2 men he had known since before he took over the organization. Men who had handled his personal legal affairs completely separately from the organization's official legal team men whose loyalty was to him specifically, and who had never had any professional relationship with Marco Bellini. Clara spent those 3 hours in the room Damien had given her access to at the secondary property, working through the photographs of her father's 12 pages, cross-referencing every name, every number, every notation against the full body of evidence she had now assembled. By midnight, she had built a complete timeline. Not just of the financial fraud, of everything. 7 years ago, Robert Bennett discovers the fraud and begins documenting it. Takes documentation to Vincent Vittorio. Vincent is informed. Marco learns Vincent has been informed. 6 years and 2 months ago, Vincent Vittorio dies of an apparent heart attack. 6 years ago, Robert Bennett disappears. 4 years ago, Damien Vittorio takes over the organization. Marco Bellini remains in his position, trusted and untouched, the bridge between the old leadership and the new. 3 months ago, Damien initiates a financial review of the real estate holdings. Marco realizes the review is going to expose the fraud. Begins accelerating his exit plan. Deploys Caruso and Ferretti. 11 days ago, Marco makes the final payment to the Miami entity. William Reyes. The exit is fully funded. 4 days ago, Clara tells Damien to leave through the back door. She looked at the full timeline laid out in front of her. Everything was here. Every connection. Every link. The financial fraud. The external protection scheme. The 2 deaths. Vincent Vittorio and her father both, because whatever had happened to Robert Bennett, it had happened because Marco had needed to silence him after Vincent was gone. And the assassination attempt. She had everything except one thing. She knew what had happened. She needed to know exactly how. And the specific mechanism of how her father had been silenced, was the piece that Marco still held. She was still at the table at 1 a.m. when Damien came back from his legal conversations and stood in the doorway of the room for a moment without saying anything, looking at what she had spread across the table. Sit down, she said. He sat. She walked him through the complete timeline. Every piece, every connection, every link from beginning to end. She spoke clearly and without embellishment, and she watched his face as she spoke, watching him absorb each piece the way you watch someone put together a photograph of something they've already suspected, but haven't allowed themselves to see in full. When she finished, the room was quiet. William Reyes received a payment 11 days ago, Damien said. Yes. Which means Marco told Reyes he was moving. Reyes would have had to clear certain channels before Marco could safely exit. That's my reading. Which means Reyes knows the timeline. He knows when Marco plans to leave. Clara looked at him. She had not taken this next step herself. She had been so focused on the evidence assembly that she hadn't followed the logic to where it was now pointing. If we approach Reyes, she said slowly, before Marco does, Reyes has no loyalty to Marco, Damien said. He has a financial arrangement. If the financial arrangement becomes a liability instead of an asset, he flips, Clara said. He tells us exactly where Marco is planning to go. And when. More than that, Damien said. Reyes has 11 years of intelligence on Marco's operation. If he cooperates, we have everything Marco thought he'd buried. The possibility of it spread between them like light coming under a door. Reyes will want protection, Clara said. He'll want a guarantee that his own exposure doesn't destroy him. That depends on what he's willing to give us, and whether what he gives us is enough to make that deal worth making. Can you make that deal? Damien looked at her steadily. I can make a case to the right people that cooperating against Marco Bellini is worth certain accommodations, he said carefully, especially given the information in your father's documentation about the names Marco had in positions of authority. She understood what he wasn't quite saying. You're talking about law enforcement contact. I'm talking about a controlled conversation with the right person in the right context about what we have and what we're prepared to provide, in exchange for the space to finish this correctly. He paused. Not a surrender. A negotiation. The same kind of negotiation my father was trying to start 6 years ago, she said. The words landed between them without drama. Yes, Damien said. Except this time with more evidence, and this time with me sitting at the table instead of your father standing outside it. She looked at the timeline in front of her. Who do you trust in law enforcement? She said. One person, Damien said. An FBI agent named Catherine Walsh. She's worked the organized crime division for 15 years. She has never once leaked a source, and she has a case record that indicates she is more interested in major prosecutorial outcomes than in collecting smaller wins. He paused. She's been trying to reach me for 8 months. You haven't responded. No. Call her tonight, Clara said. It can't be undone, he said. Once that call is made, I know. Call her anyway. He looked at her across the table for a long moment. You came here to expose Marco Bellini, he said, not to restructure my relationship with federal law enforcement. I came here to find the truth about my father, she said, and to make sure that the man responsible for what happened to him and to yours cannot walk away from it. If doing that requires uncomfortable conversations, then we have uncomfortable conversations. He was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then he picked up his phone. The call to Catherine Walsh lasted 22 minutes, and Clara heard only Damien's side of it, but she didn't need the other side to understand what was happening. Damien spoke with the precise, minimal efficiency of a man who had decided exactly how much to say and was not prepared to say one word more. He confirmed what he had. He described the documentation without specifying its full scope. He said the name Marco Bellini twice. He said the name William Reyes once. He said that he was prepared to cooperate in a specific and limited way in exchange for specific and limited guarantees. And he said it in a tone that made clear it was not a negotiation for the other party to shape it, was an offer, and the other party could accept it or not. He ended the call and put the phone on the table. She'll have her supervisor's authorization by morning, he said. Clara nodded. And Marco? She asked. Marco has a scheduled call with the estate's accounting team at 9 a.m., routine financial review meeting. He scheduled it himself 2 weeks ago. Damien's voice was flat with the precise flatness she now recognized as the register he used when something required control. He's going to use that call to look at the records we've been in. He's going to try to find out what the review has surfaced. He's going to find the seam, Clara said. Yes, which means by 10 a.m. tomorrow, Marco will know something is wrong. Which is why I need you inside the house before 9. She looked at him. There's something you want me to do before 10 a.m. tomorrow, she said. Yes, Damien said. I need you to access the estate's main server room, the full financial archive, the original unaltered records before Marco had the chance to adjust them. They're preserved on a backup system that hasn't been touched in 3 years because the tech team flagged the backup as corrupted and decommissioned it. Is it actually corrupted? No, it's the cleanest record we have, untouched since before Marco began his systematic alterations. He paused. I need you to pull it before Marco accesses the accounting team's records and realizes the backup exists and destroys it. The server room is restricted access. I know. He slid a card across the table. It isn't anymore. She picked up the card. And once I have the backup, then we have everything. Damien said. The original records plus your father's documentation plus the communication trail plus Reyes. And Marco Bellini has nothing left to hide behind. She held the card in her hand and thought about what tomorrow morning meant, walking back into that house, moving through it before 9 a.m., getting into a restricted server room, pulling a backup that Marco was about to try to destroy, and being out before 10 a.m. when the walls started closing. One more thing, she said. What, Chidi? Ferretti. He surfaced today and reached someone inside the house. Whatever happens tomorrow morning, Ferretti is still loose and he's still a variable. I can't calculate. We found him, Damien said. She looked up sharply. When? 2 hours ago. Stefano's people located him at a property in South Boston. His voice was completely even. He's no longer a variable. She sat with that for a moment. Did he say anything? He said enough, Damien said. The conversation inside the house the 2 staff members you heard was Marco telling him to accelerate. He's pushing the timeline up. How far up? Ferretti believed Marco was planning to leave Thursday. Thursday is 2 days from now, Clara said. Yes. Then we don't have until the end of the week. We have until Thursday morning. That's why you're in the server room by 8 a.m. She looked at the access card in her hand. Then I should sleep, she said. I need to be sharp tomorrow. Clara. He said her name in the tone that meant something he hadn't said yet was coming. I need you to understand something before tomorrow. All right. If something goes wrong in that house tomorrow, if Marco moves faster than we've calculated, or Ferretti told him something we don't know, or any variable we haven't accounted for surfaces, you leave. You don't try to complete the pull. You don't try to finish anything. You leave. She held his gaze. I understand. I need more than your understanding. I need your word. She looked at him. This man who had spent his life in a world where a given word meant something, or it meant nothing, and whose ability to tell the difference had kept him alive. And she thought about her father, who had not left, who had stayed and finished what he came to do, and paid the price that staying had cost. She thought about what she owed her father, and she thought about what her father, who had written, "If something happens," and had hidden 12 pages for someone to find, had actually been asking her to do. He had not been asking her to die for the truth. He had been asking her to find it. You have my word, she said. Damien nodded once. Get some sleep, he said. She stood up from the table and picked up her bag and the access card, and she was halfway to the door when his voice caught her. Robert Bennett. She stopped. He was a good man, Damien said. He walked into something most people would have walked away from. He got the information to my father. Without him, my father might have died without ever knowing. His voice was the same controlled flatness it always was, and underneath it was the thing his control was containing, the grief and the guilt and the 4 years of not looking, all of it right there at the surface. That matters. I want you to know I understand that it matters. She stood in the doorway for a moment without turning around. He would have liked knowing someone was going to finish it, she said finally. She walked out. She was at the servants' entrance at 7:58 in the morning. The estate was quiet in the particular way that large households are quiet in the morning, the deep staff already working. The principal's not yet present, a temporary stillness that exists between the night and the day that the house serves. She signed in. She collected her cart. She moved toward her floor assignment with the unhurried pace of a woman who knows exactly what she is supposed to be doing. And then she turned left toward the east wing instead of right toward the main corridor. The server room was at the end of a restricted access corridor that she had mapped during her 3rd week at the estate. The corridor was used by the technical staff twice daily, morning and evening checks, and otherwise empty. She had timed the morning check. It happened at 7:30, which meant the corridor would be clear until noon. She swiped Damien's card at the door. The light went green. She was inside in 10 seconds. The backup system was exactly where Damien had described it, a decommissioned server unit set against the east wall, labeled in the tech team's filing system as non-functional pending disposal. She had a drive. She had the access card. She had 8 minutes before the absolute outside edge of the window she had calculated. She connected the drive. The system wasn't corrupted. It was pristine, 3 years of unaltered financial records, clean and original, the before picture to the after picture Marco had spent years creating. The transfer took 4 minutes and 11 seconds. She disconnected the drive with 3 minutes to spare. She was back in the main corridor, with her cart at 8:15, moving toward her floor assignment, as if she had been there all morning. At 8:47, she passed the doorway to the estate's private study and heard Marco Bellini's voice through the barely open door, low and controlled on a call she could hear only fragments of. "The review found something. I need to know how much." She kept walking, kept her pace, kept her face exactly as it always was. Marco knew. Not everything, but enough. The financial review had surfaced something, and Marco was already on the phone trying to find out how much of it was visible. She was at the east gate at 8:59. Gio was waiting. She got in the car and said 3 words. "He already knows." And the final phase of everything they had been building began to run. Marco Bellini, who had spent 11 years constructing the perfect escape, was about to discover that the woman he had looked at twice, once in the corridor when he said her name, and once in the main hallway when she pushed a cart past him with her eyes on the floor, had been 1 step ahead of him the entire time. And the step she had just taken was the one that closed every door he had left himself. He already knows. Those 3 words changed the temperature of everything. Gio pulled away from the east gate without being asked, reading the urgency the way he had been reading Damien's situations for 30 years. Clara sat in the back with the drive in her hand, and her mind already 3 steps ahead, recalculating every variable that Marco's awareness changed. She called Damien before Gio had gone 2 blocks. "He was already on a call when I came out," she said, the moment Damien picked up. "He knows the review found something. He's trying to determine how much is visible. We have hours, not days." How did he find out this fast? Someone inside the accounting team. He still has a contact there. Someone the review process routed information through before it was supposed to reach you. He planned for this contingency too. She paused. "Damien, he's going to move today. Not Thursday. Today." A silence of exactly 2 seconds. "Walsh confirmed the authorization at 6 this morning," Damien said. "She wants a meeting at noon. We can't wait until noon. If Marco makes contact with Reyes before we do..." Walsh is already moving on Reyes. That was part of the authorization. She's had a parallel interest in Reyes for 3 years apparently. Our information gave her the connection she needed to act. Clara processed this. She's been building toward Reyes independently, which is why she moved so fast on the authorization. We didn't just give her Marco. We gave her the anchor for a much larger case she's been working. Then Reyes is neutralized. By noon, yes. His communication channels will be under federal monitoring before Marco can reach him. That leaves Marco with no exit, Clara said. No funded destination, no federal protection, and a financial record that now exists in clean, unaltered form on the drive in my hand. She sat back. He's going to panic. Panicked men make mistakes. Panicked men also burn things down, she said. "Damien, if Marco realizes the exit is closed before we can contain him, he doesn't run, he fights. He uses whatever leverage he still has inside the organization. He calls in debts. He tries to destabilize everything fast enough to create cover for himself in the chaos." "I know. Who does he have left inside the organization? People who owe him people. He has something on. People who've been part of this long enough that they're implicated whether they want to be or not." 3 names, Damien said. "I've had Stefano working that question since yesterday. There are 3 people at the senior level whose continued loyalty to Marco is probable, given the length and nature of their association with him." "Who?" He gave her the names. She recognized 2 of them from the meeting room the night everything started. Men who had been present, who had watched her walk in and interrupt a conversation between powerful people, who had seen the look on Damien's face before he followed her out. "They were in that room," she said. Yes. Then they already know something happened that night that Damien hasn't fully explained. Marco will use that. He'll tell them the version of events that positions Damien as the threat and himself as the person trying to protect the organization. I know. Damien said again, and the repetition of it, the quiet steadiness of it, told her he had been ahead of her on this, that this was a problem he had been sitting with since before she called. That's why I need you here. Not at the estate. Here. With the drive and everything on it. We're meeting Walsh at noon, and I need the full picture assembled before we walk into that room. Then tell Gio to drive faster, she said. From the front seat without a word, Gio accelerated. Jatropia. She had 2 hours before the Walsh meeting, and she used every minute of them. The secondary property had become, over the past 4 days, something between a war room and a research office. The kind of space that forms when people are working on a problem with genuine urgency. Papers, laptops, cold coffee, the particular organized disorder of concentrated effort. Stefano was there when she arrived, and he looked at her face when she came through the door and immediately cleared half the table without being asked. She laid everything out. The drive with the backup records, the photographs of her father's 12 pages, the communication records from the network panel, the Marchetti documentation, the complete financial timeline she had assembled over 3 days and nights, the William Reyes connection. Every piece of it arranged in the order that built the story most efficiently from beginning to end. Stefano stood at the edge of the table and looked at it all for a long moment. That's everything, he said. It wasn't a question. That's everything except the direct evidence of what happened to my father after he met with Vincent. She said it evenly. That part we may not find, but the rest of it is complete. It's enough to take him apart. It has to be, she said. She sat down and started organizing the sequencing. What Walsh would need first, what required context before it could be understood, what spoke for itself without explanation. She had watched her father build presentations of complex financial information when she was a child, sitting at the kitchen table, while he worked, watching him think about how to make numbers tell their story in a way that couldn't be misread or dismissed. She hadn't understood then what she was absorbing. She understood now. At 10:45, Damien came into the room. He was dressed differently than she had seen him before, not in the way that signal effort, but in the way that signals a decision has been made. Composed, present. The way a man looks when he has finished the internal argument and is now on the other side of it. He looked at the table. Walk me through the sequence, he said. She did. 20 minutes, start to finish, every piece in its place. He listened without interrupting except twice, once to ask a clarifying question about the Reyes payment timeline, once to ask how certain she was of the connection between the third external communication number and the shell entity. Certain enough to present it as confirmed, she said. Walsh's team can close the last degree of separation on the technical side. What I have is sufficient to establish the pattern. He nodded. The backup records on the drive, he said. You're confident they're clean, unaltered. I compared the first 3 years of entries to the copies in your father's era documentation when I was pulling the transfer. The numbers match precisely. What's on that drive is exactly what the books looked like before Marco touched them. Damien looked at the drive. My father kept clean books, he said quietly. He did, Clara said. A brief silence. All right, Damien said. There's one more thing before noon. She looked at him. Marco called me 20 minutes ago. The room went very still. What did he say? He said he'd become aware that the Financial Review had surfaced some irregularities in the real estate records. He said he was concerned. He said he wanted to meet this afternoon to go over the details together, as he'd always done for me when complicated situations arose. Damien's voice was completely level. He sounded exactly the way he always sounds, warm, concerned, entirely trustworthy. What did you tell him? I told him I appreciated his concern. I told him I was tied up until late afternoon. I told him we'd find a time before end of day. He believed you. He has no reason not to, Not yet. Damien paused. But the call tells us one thing definitively. He doesn't know about Walsh. He doesn't know about Reyes. He still thinks his exit is intact. He's trying to get in front of it, Clara said. One final conversation positioned as him helping you understand a complicated situation. He was going to frame the irregularities as something he'd been managing on the family's behalf. Give himself a clean explanation for what the review found before you could look at it without his narrative attached. Yes. It won't work now, but he doesn't know that. No, Damien said. He doesn't. He looked at her across the table. Afternoon after Walsh, I'm calling a meeting of the senior figures. All of them. Including the 3 Stefano flagged. He paused. I'm going to need you in that room. She hadn't expected that. You want me in the senior meeting. I want the person who built this case in the room when it's presented. These are men who have operated on a principle of visible power for their entire professional lives. The weight of what we're presenting needs to be visible. He paused. You're part of the weight. She thought about what it meant, a maid sitting in a room with the organization's senior figures presenting evidence that was going to restructure everything they thought they understood about their own world. She thought about her father, who had never been given that room. All right, she said. Catherine Walsh was 44 years old and looked like someone who had spent 15 years in rooms where people tried to read her and found less than they expected. She had the particular quality of stillness that comes from spending a career listening more than speaking, the practiced neutrality of someone who has learned that most people, if you stay quiet long enough, will fill the silence with exactly what you need to know. She looked at Clara for exactly 3 seconds when they were introduced, and then she looked at the table and what was laid out on it. Tell me where to start, she said. Clara started at the beginning. She spoke for 35 minutes. Walsh interrupted 11 times, not with challenges, with precision questions. The questions of someone building her own parallel structure of understanding alongside the one being presented. When Clara finished, Walsh sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then looked at Damien. The backup records on the drive, Walsh said. I'm going to need my forensic team to verify the chain of custody. Understood, Damien said. The 12 pages from the archive, the original document from Robert Bennett. That goes into federal evidence immediately. Clara, Damien said. Walsh looked at her. Those are my father's documents, Clara said. I know, Walsh said. And something in the way she said it, direct, without condescension, without the institutional dismissiveness that Clara had spent years expecting from anyone in a position of official authority, made Clara look at her more carefully. He tried to do this 6 years ago, Clara said. He brought this to Vincent Vittorio. He tried to start exactly this kind of conversation. And he disappeared. I know, Walsh said again. I have his missing persons file. It's been in my peripheral file for 2 years, an open case with no movement that kept showing up adjacent to financial trails I was following. I didn't have the connection to make it central. A pause. I'm sorry it took this long. Clara held her gaze. The documents go into evidence, she said. But I want his name attached to what they expose, officially, in the record. Walsh didn't hesitate. Robert Bennett will be credited as the originating source of the financial fraud documentation. That's the accurate record. That's what goes in. Clara nodded once and looked at Damien. All right, she said. Kid. The Walsh meeting lasted 2 hours and 10 minutes. By the time it ended, 3 things had been set in motion. Walsh's team had confirmed that Reyes's communication channels were under federal monitoring. Reyes himself, presented with the scope of his exposure, had agreed to a cooperation conversation that was already producing information, not about Marco specifically, not yet, but about the infrastructure surrounding him, the channels and connections that Marco had used as insulation. A federal warrant was being prepared for Marco Bellini on charges that Walsh said, with the particular careful precision of a prosecutor counting her certainties, would not be difficult to sustain. And Clara's father's file was being transferred from the cold case division to an active federal investigation. She didn't let herself feel that last one fully. Not yet. Later, when there was space for it, she would sit with what it meant that Robert Bennett's case was moving again after 6 years. Right now, there was still too much in motion. They left the Walsh meeting at 2:15 in the afternoon. In the car, Damien said, "The senior meeting is at 4. Does Marco know about it?" He received the same notification as everyone else. A general meeting called by Me Agenda, listed as organizational restructuring in light of the financial review findings. He paused. He'll come. He'll think it's his chance to shape the narrative in the room, Clara said. Yes. He's going to walk in expecting to be the most prepared person there. Yes, Damien said. And there was something in his voice that was not satisfaction. Something more complicated than satisfaction, the voice of a man who is about to close a door that has been open for 4 years and who understands the full weight of what closing it means. Are you ready for this? She asked. He looked out the window for a moment. My father trusted that man for 30 years, he said. I trusted him for 4. Whatever I feel about what we're about to do. He stopped. It doesn't change what needs to happen. No, she said. It doesn't. He looked at her. Are you ready? She thought about her father's handwriting, the 12 pages, the last line. He needs to know who Marco Bellini really is. I've been ready for 4 years, she said. Chut. The senior figures assembled at 4 in the conference room of the secondary property, not the estate which Damien had deliberately avoided because the estate was Marco's ground in a way that this location wasn't. There were 8 men in the room. 7 of them were present because Damien had called them there. The 8th Marco Bellini arrived at 4:02, with the ease of a man who has never once been late to anything important, who understands punctuality as a form of control, who has spent 30 years arriving at exactly the right moment and being exactly the right thing for whatever the room required. He looked around the table. He saw Clara, and his eyes paused on her for exactly half a second, and then moved on with no visible change in expression. Half a second was enough. She had seen it. She knew what it meant. He had registered her presence in this room as the first thing that didn't fit the calculation he'd walked in with, and he had absorbed it and filed it without letting it show. He was very, very good. He sat down 3 seats from Damien, the position he always occupied, close enough to read everything and far enough to watch the whole room. Damien let 2 minutes of settling silence pass. Then he said, "Thank you for coming on short notice. What I have to present this afternoon is significant, and I want everyone in this room to hear it directly from me rather than from any secondary account." He looked around the table. We've identified a systematic financial fraud operating inside this organization for 11 years. The full scope is documented and has been independently verified. He paused. The source is someone in this room. The room changed. Not dramatically. These were men trained not to react dramatically. But it changed in the way rooms change when a true and devastating thing enters them, without warning, a collective intake of stillness, the human reflex of bodies that have just received information they haven't processed yet. Marco's face was composed. His hands were flat on the table. He was performing the reaction of a man who has just heard something shocking, and he was performing it with the fluency of 3 decades of practice. He was also, Clara observed, slightly pale. I'd like to understand more before we discuss implications, Marco said. His voice was exactly right, concerned, measured the voice of a senior advisor who takes his responsibility seriously. What's the nature of the fraud and how was it identified? Damien looked at him. Clara, he said. She stood, and she presented everything. Not all of it at once. She had thought carefully about sequencing about how to build the case in front of an audience who needed to follow the logic in real time, who needed to understand each layer before the next one could carry its full weight. She started with the financial architecture, the original versus the altered records, the 11-year pattern of redirected payments. She showed the backup drive records and their correspondence with her father's original documentation. She showed the communication trail, the shell entities, the Reyes connection. She was aware every minute of Marco on her left. He was listening. She could feel the quality of his attention, the way you can feel a change in air pressure. He was listening and calculating, running the same process in real time that she had run over days and nights, assessing what was confirmed versus what was inferential, what could be challenged versus what was closed. She watched him understand piece by piece that the gaps he had left himself were gone. She watched him understand that Reyes was compromised. She watched him understand when she got to the communication records and named the 3 external numbers and the Miami entity that his exit was closed. His hands flat on the table did not move. His face did not change. But his breathing changed. Barely fractionally, in a way that most people in the room would not notice, and that Clara noticed completely. She finished with her father's 12 pages. She read the last line aloud. He needs to know who Marco Bellini really is. The room was absolutely silent. This is extraordinary, Marco said. His voice was still warm, still measured. The voice of a man who has absolute confidence in his own ability to navigate whatever the situation requires, and who has decided that the situation requires him to appear above it. I understand why the documentation looks the way it does. But I want to be clear about the context because some of what's been presented here represents a significant misreading of decisions that were made on behalf of this family's protection. Marco. Damien's voice was quiet. Stop. Marco stopped. It was the first time in 30 years Clara thought that anyone had told Marco Bellini to stop in a room like this, and the effect of it was visible not on Marco's face, which remained composed, but in the half-second stillness of every other person in the room, registering the shift. The federal warrant was issued at 3:45 this afternoon, Damien said. Agent Walsh's team is at the estate now. Your office, your personal files, your vehicle. He paused. William Reyes entered cooperation negotiations at 2 p.m. The communication records are under federal monitoring and have been since this morning. Marco's composure held for 3 more seconds. 3 seconds of a man holding something together that is coming apart, applying 30 years of trained control to a situation that his control was no longer able to contain. Then something in his face changed. Not collapse. Nothing so simple. Something more precise, the shift of a man who has assessed the room and understood finally and completely that there is no angle left. You moved fast, he said. Not accusingly. Almost. Clara thought with the professional appreciation of a man who recognizes a well-executed operation. I had good help, Damien said. Marco looked at Clara. Really looked at her for the first time since she had walked into that meeting room 7 days ago and told a man to leave through the back door. Not the assessing look of someone cataloging a potential threat. The full look of a man who is seeing in its complete form the thing that ended him. The maid, he said. The accountant's daughter, Clara said. Something moved across his face. Not remorse. She didn't think Marco Bellini was capable of remorse in the way the word usually meant. But recognition. The recognition of a man who understood in this moment the full shape of what had happened to him. That the daughter of the man he had silenced 6 years ago had walked into his house and spent 7 weeks dismantling everything he had spent 11 years building. Your father was a careful man, Marco said. Yes, she said. He was. So am I. What followed was not a scene from a movie. There was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voice, no act of violence. Damien had made that decision before the meeting, and Clara had agreed with it, not because Marco didn't deserve dramatic confrontation, but because the thing Marco feared most was not pain or even loss of freedom. The thing Marco Bellini feared most was the dismantling of the power that had defined him for 30 years. And that dismantling was already happening in the room methodically and completely in front of the men who had been his colleagues and his audience. Damien called Walsh. Walsh arrived at the secondary property at 5:07 with 2 colleagues from the Federal Organized Crime Division. Marco Bellini left the building in federal custody at 5:22. He walked out under his own power, composed, still performing even now some version of himself that he could not fully stop performing, because he had been performing it for so long, it had become the only thing he knew how to be. Clara stood in the corridor and watched him go. She felt nothing like what she had expected to feel. She had imagined over 4 years of working toward this moment that it would arrive with some release of pressure, some physical experience of weightlifting, of the particular relief of a thing finished. What she felt instead was something quieter and more complicated. The feeling of a woman standing on the other side of a door she has spent years trying to open, discovering that the room behind it is real but different from the room she had imagined. Marco was in custody. The financial fraud was documented. The federal case was moving. But she still didn't know, not in the specific way that her father deserved, what had happened to Robert Bennett after he left Vincent Vittorio and walked back out into a world where Marco Bellini was already deciding what to do about him. She would find that part. She had not stopped working toward it. But tonight was not that night. Tonight was this night. The 3 senior figures that Stefano had flagged were the last to leave the meeting room. 2 of them left quickly, the body language of men who understood that speed of separation from the situation was in their interest. The third one, a man named Anthony Carrera, who had been with the organization for 22 years and whose involvement with Marco, according to Stefano, was more pragmatic than loyal, lingered near the door until the others were gone and then turned back toward Damien. "I need you to know," Carrera said carefully, "that the level of my involvement in any of what was presented today is significantly less than it might appear from association alone." "I know," Damien said. Carrera nodded slowly. "I should have seen it," he said. "We all should have seen it." "Yes," Damien said. "We should have." A silence. "Is there something you want to tell me now?" Damien asked. Carrera looked at Clara, not with hostility, with the slightly uncomfortable recognition of someone facing a situation that requires more honesty than he is naturally inclined toward. "Marco asked me 3 months ago whether I had any concerns about Damien's financial review," Carrera said. "He framed it as organizational loyalty, whether I thought the review was a sign of instability at the top. I told him I had no concerns." He paused. "I didn't tell you he'd asked." "Why?" "Because I didn't know what it meant yet, and by the time I had a sense of what it might mean, the most powerful advisor in this organization had been asking me questions I didn't want to be seen as having answered incorrectly." "That's a careful way of saying you were afraid," Damien said. "Yes," Carrera said simply. "That's what it is." Damien looked at him for a moment. "Tell Walsh's people everything you just told me. Everything Marco has ever asked you that you found unusual. Every question, every conversation, every request that didn't sit right." He paused. "Your cooperation is the difference between being part of the accounting of this and being part of what's accounted for." Carrera nodded. He left. Damien looked at the empty room. 3 months ago," he said, "Marco was asking senior figures whether they had concerns about me. He was building his case inside the organization, preparing the narrative he'd need if Caruso and Ferretti succeeded, and he was the one who had to explain what happened. He had a plan for every scenario," Clara said. "That's what 11 years of preparation looks like." "It didn't work." "No." Damien turned to look at her. "Because of your father's 12 pages in a basement archive," he said. "And because you went looking for them." She thought about that, the chain of it, her father hiding those pages with enough deliberateness that someone looking for exactly that thing could find them, the archive that nobody had thought to sort through in 6 years. The thin margin by which some truths survive when the system built to suppress them has every advantage. "He knew someone might come looking," she said. "He didn't know it would be me. He just knew the evidence needed to exist somewhere that Marco couldn't reach." "He trusted the right kind of person to find it," Damien said. "He trusted anyone who loved him enough to keep looking," she said. "Boy." At 7 in the evening, Stefano brought her a phone. "Walsh," he said. She took the call. "We've begun processing Marco's files," Walsh said. "There's significant material. It's going to take several days to fully catalog. But I wanted to tell you something now before the process gets further along." Clara waited. "We found a communication record in Marco's personal files. Encrypted, but our team broke it within the hour. It's a message exchange from 6 years ago." Walsh paused. "The specific date corresponds to 2 days after your father's disappearance." Clara sat down. "The exchange is between Marco and a contact we're currently identifying," Walsh said. "The content makes clear that your father was detained. Marco's language is indirect, but the meaning is not ambiguous. He was held. He was questioned about who else he had spoken to and what documentation existed beyond what Marco already knew about." Walsh's voice was even professional, and underneath the professionalism was something that Clara heard as the particular care of a person who understands what they are delivering. "According to the exchange, your father told them nothing. He confirmed no other contacts. He gave no additional documentation." Clara's throat was tight. "He protected Vincent Vittorio," she said. "He didn't tell them he'd already gone to Vincent. That's the inference, yes. He protected the channel." A pause. The exchange suggests he was released, not harmed beyond the initial detention. Marco's calculation at that point was that eliminating him created more risk than containment. The official disappearance was arranged. But Clara. Walsh's voice shifted slightly. "The exchange references a destination." She closed her eyes. "He's alive," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "We don't know that yet. The destination referenced is 6 years old, but the exchange does not indicate otherwise. We're pursuing it now as an active line." Clara sat with the phone in her hand, and the silence in the room around her, and the knowledge not yet confirmed, not yet real in the way it would need to become real, that her father might be somewhere in the world 6 years older, and whatever he had survived had required him to stay away from everything he had left behind. She thought about her mother. She thought about the coat in the hallway closet. "Walsh," she said. Her voice was steady. It surprised her that it was, but it was. "Whatever resources you can put toward that line, please." "We already have," Walsh said. "I'll update you the moment we have anything confirmed." She ended the call. Stefano was still in the doorway. He had heard enough to know what had happened, or close enough to it, and he was watching her with the particular expression of a man who doesn't know what to do with someone else's emotion and respects it enough not to try. Damien came through the door 30 seconds later. He looked at her face. "What happened?" she told him. She watched his face change when she said the words "not alive," "not confirmed," but a destination, a line being pursued, a thread that 6 years ago was cut, and tonight might not be. He sat down across from her, and he didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "We'll find him." 2 words. Simple. No qualification. No careful hedging. "Damien, we'll find him," he said again. "Whatever it takes. Every resource I have." He looked at her steadily. "Your father walked into this family's house and tried to save my father, and paid a price he should never have had to pay. If he is alive somewhere, we are going to find him." A pause. "That's not a promise I'm making to be kind. It's a commitment." She looked at him for a long moment. She had spent 4 years alone with this. 4 years of calculations and preparations, and the particular loneliness of carrying something no one else could carry with you. And now she was sitting across from a man who had spent 4 years with his own version of the same thing. His own unanswered question about his father, his own 4 years of choosing not to look, and then choosing to look, and the two of them had arrived at this same table by paths that had begun in the same place 6 years ago. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. It was past 9 when most of the activity had quieted enough for Clara to be alone for the first time in what felt like days. She sat in the small room she had been using at the secondary property, and held her phone and looked at nothing for a while. She thought about her mother, who needed to know that the case was moving, who had spent 6 years in a particular kind of suspended state, not grieving, because grief requires a certainty that disappearance doesn't provide, not hoping, because hope is unbearable when it has no evidence to stand on. Tonight, there was evidence. Not enough. Not yet. But something, a thread, a direction, a communication from 6 years ago that pointed toward a man who had, according to the only record they had been released. She would call her mother tomorrow. Not tonight. Tonight was too raw. The information too incomplete, the space between what was confirmed and what they were hoping too wide to bridge with a phone call at 9 p.m. without causing a specific kind of harm. Tomorrow, when she had slept and had more of the shape of what Walsh's team was finding, she would call. She put the phone down. There was a knock at the door. It was Gio, which was unusual enough that she straightened immediately. "I don't generally do this," Gio said. He was holding 2 cups of coffee, and he held one out toward her with the matter-of-fact directness of a man who has decided something and is doing it. "But you look like someone who hasn't eaten since yesterday, and coffee is the closest available option." She took the cup. "Thank you, Gio." He started to leave. "Gio." He turned back. "You worked for his father," she said. "Vincent Vittorio." 22 years, Gio said. "Before Damien. Did you know my father, Robert Bennett?" Gio looked at her for a moment. "I drove him," Gio said. "Once. He came to the house to see Mr. Vincent. I picked him up from a coffee shop on Hanover Street and drove him to the estate and waited while he was inside." A pause. "He tipped me $20 and apologized for keeping me waiting." Nobody tipped me in those days. Nobody apologized for keeping me waiting. Clara pressed her lips together. "He was inside for about an hour," Gio continued. "When he came out, he looked lighter, I thought at the time, like someone who has done something difficult and come out the other side of it. He thanked me again. I drove him back to Hanover Street." He paused. "I never saw him again. And then Mr. Vincent died. And I thought about that man sometimes, the accountant who tipped $20. I thought he must not have known what a dangerous house he'd been in." "He knew exactly what house it was," Clara said. "He went in anyway." Gio nodded slowly. "He did," he said. "He did go in anyway." He looked at her. "So did you." He went back out into the corridor, and Clara sat with the coffee, and the quiet, and the weight of what had happened today. All of it Marco in custody. The federal case moving Walsh's team, and the 6-year-old communication record, and the thread pointing toward a destination, and her father tipping a driver $20 and walking out of a house that had been trying to destroy him looking lighter. Like someone who has done something difficult and come out the other side. She was not on the other side yet, but for the first time in 4 years, she could see where it was. She drank the coffee and let herself feel for exactly one honest moment the full size of how tired she was, how much she had carried, how much further there still was to go. And then she set the cup down. Because the thread Walsh was following was active, and she was not done, and Robert Bennett's daughter did not stop when there was still a thread to pull. She picked up her phone and called Walsh. "What do you have so far?" she said. And Walsh told her. Walsh talked for 41 minutes. Clara didn't interrupt once. What Walsh had found in Marco's encrypted files was not a single answer. It was a chain, a series of communications spanning 6 years, fragmentary in places precise. In others, the accumulated record of a man managing a problem he had never fully resolved. Because Robert Bennett had been a problem, Marco couldn't cleanly eliminate. Not after Vincent Vittorio had already been briefed. Not with the risk that a dead accountant would generate more scrutiny than a disappeared one. And not, Walsh said carefully, because Marco had any particular reluctance about what the alternative would have required. He had been pragmatic about it. That was the word Walsh used. Pragmatic. Robert Bennett had been relocated. That was the clinical term in the communication records. Relocated and contained under conditions that ensured his silence, not through ongoing physical confinement. Walsh explained, but through the particular leverage that a man like Marco understood how to apply with surgical precision. People. The people Robert Bennett loved. The wife he had kissed on the cheek at 7:45 on a Tuesday morning. The daughter he had told to eat the leftover pasta. As long as Marco was free and operational, Robert Bennett's silence was guaranteed by the one thing stronger than fear: love. Clara sat with the phone against her ear and let that land completely. Her father had not disappeared because Marco had eliminated him. Her father had disappeared because Marco had made him understand with absolute clarity what would happen to his family if he ever surfaced. He had been protecting them. For 6 years from wherever he was, he had been protecting them by staying gone. "Where is he?" she said. "Montreal," Walsh said. "We have a confirmed identity match as of 2 hours ago. He's been living under a modified identity, not a full construction, more of a partial obscurity. Working as a bookkeeper for a small import business." A pause. "Clara, he's in good health. Our field contact confirmed visual." She closed her eyes. Montreal, 400 miles away. A bookkeeper for a small import business. Her father, who had hummed folk songs over his kitchen table, who had tipped drivers $20 and apologized for keeping them waiting, who had walked into the most dangerous house in Boston because he believed the truth was worth the cost of carrying it. He was alive. He was 400 miles away. And he had spent 6 years believing that staying away was the only way to keep his family safe. "He doesn't know Marco is in custody," she said. "No, he has no way of knowing. His access to anything connected to the Vittorio organization or to Marco Bellini specifically would have been completely severed as a condition of his arrangement." "He doesn't know it's over." "No," Walsh said quietly. "He doesn't." Clara opened her eyes. "I need to go to Montreal," she said. Walsh didn't hesitate. "I'll have someone coordinate with our field contact there. You'll have everything you need by morning." "Tonight," Clara said. A brief silence. "Tonight," Walsh said. She found Damien in the main room of the secondary property going through the documentation. Walsh's team had requested copies of, organizing it with the same methodical precision he brought to everything, the discipline of a man who processes difficulty through work, because work is the only container reliable enough to hold what he's feeling without spilling. He looked up when she came in. He read her face in approximately 1 second. "Walsh found something," he said. "My father is in Montreal." She said it straight out, the way she had said everything to Damien over the past days, directly, without softening, because softening it would have felt dishonest, and he had never once asked her to soften anything. "He's alive. He's been there for 6 years. Marco used us, our safety, as the mechanism to keep him silent. He disappeared voluntarily to protect us." Damien set down the papers in his hand. "He doesn't know it's over," she said. "I need to go tonight." "Gio," Damien said immediately, not to her, but raising his voice toward the corridor. Gio appeared in the doorway within 4 seconds. He had, Clara thought, the gift of being exactly where he was needed, without ever appearing to be waiting for it. "Drive to the airport," Damien said. "Tonight." "There's a 10 p.m. departure," Clara said. "I checked on the way in. There's a private departure at 9:45, Damien said. He looked at her. "Faster, and you don't have to sit in an airport for 2 hours managing what you're feeling right now." She looked at him. He picked the papers back up with complete equanimity, as if arranging a private departure for someone at 9:45 in the evening were exactly as ordinary as everything else that had happened today. "You should call your mother," he said, not looking up from the papers. "Before you leave, not to tell her everything, there's still too much moving, but she should hear your voice tonight." Clara stood in the doorway for a moment. In 4 years of building toward this, she had planned for the evidence, the exposure, the moment of confrontation. She had not planned for this, for the particular human texture of what came after, for the way a man she had walked into a room to use as an instrument of justice had become in the space of 7 days someone who thought about her mother. "Thank you," she said. He looked up briefly. "Go," he said. She called her mother from the car. Eleanor Bennett answered on the 3rd ring, her voice carrying the particular quality it always had at this hour, slightly cautious, The caution of a woman who had spent 6 years knowing that unexpected calls could mean anything. "Clara, is everything all right?" "Yes," Clara said. And then, because her mother deserved the truth and because she had been carrying this for too long to carry it alone for one more night. "Mom, I have something to tell you. I need you to sit down." A pause. "I'm sitting," Eleanor said. "I've been working on something for the past 4 years. Something connected to Dad. I found evidence about what happened to him. And tonight, because of that evidence, I found out where he is." The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long that Clara pulled the phone from her ear to check the connection. "Mom, where?" Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. "Montreal. He's alive. He's been there the whole time. He left to protect us and he stayed gone for the same reason. But the reason doesn't exist anymore, and I'm on my way there tonight." The sound her mother made was not quite a word. It was the sound a person makes when the thing they have trained themselves not to hope for, because hoping for it every day for 6 years is a kind of slow destruction, arrives without warning, and the body doesn't have a category for it yet. "Clara," Eleanor said finally, and her voice was shaking in a way that Clara had only heard it shake once before. The morning the detective had called to say the case was going cold. Except this time, the shaking was something completely different. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," Clara said. "I'll call you from Montreal. I promise." "Tell him—" Eleanor stopped. Started again. "Tell him the pasta went bad. He told you to eat the leftover pasta, and you didn't, and it went bad. And I've been meaning to tell him that for 6 years." Clara pressed her lips together hard. "I'll tell him," she said. She ended the call and looked out the car window at the city moving past, and let herself feel for exactly the length of 3 city blocks the full size of what was happening. The full weight of what her father had sacrificed, and what her mother had endured, and what 6 years of silence had cost both of them. She let herself feel it completely without managing it or containing it. Then she breathed. Then she looked forward. The flight to Montreal was 55 minutes. She spent most of it going over what she knew and what she didn't know, and how to say the things she needed to say to a man who had spent 6 years believing that his silence was the price of his family's safety. There was no script for this. There was no way to prepare for it the way she had prepared for everything else over 4 years. She was Robert Bennett's daughter. She would figure it out when she got there. Walsh's field contact, an agent named Torres, met her at the airport and drove her through the quiet streets of Montreal at 1 in the morning. Torres was young and said very little, which Clara appreciated. She didn't need conversation. She needed to arrive. The apartment building was in the Plateau Mont-Royal neighborhood, 4 stories brick, the kind of building that has existed long enough to feel solid in a specific way that newer buildings don't. Torres stopped outside. "3rd floor," Torres said. "Apartment 3C. I've confirmed he's home. His light was on as of midnight." A pause. "Do you want me to come up?" "No," Clara said. "Wait here." She got out of the car. She climbed 3 flights of stairs that smelled like coffee and old wood and the particular lived-in quality of a building where people have had ordinary mornings for decades. She stood in front of the door marked 3C. She knocked. Silence. She knocked again. The sound of movement inside. Cautious, the particular caution of a man who has spent 6 years opening doors carefully. "Who is it?" Her father's voice. 6 years older. Careful, but her father's voice. She had rehearsed words. She had none of them now. "It's Clara," she said. The silence on the other side of the door lasted 4 full seconds. Then the sound of a lock turning. Then another lock. Then the door opened. Robert Bennett was 50 years old and looked like a man who has spent 6 years carrying something very heavy with no one to help him carry it. He had gone gray at the temples in a way he hadn't been when she was 19. There were lines in his face that hadn't been there before. He was wearing the kind of reading glasses she didn't remember from before, pushed up on his forehead, and he was holding them there with one hand that was not quite steady. He looked at her. "Oh," he said. Just that. One syllable, the sound of a man whose control has encountered the one thing it was never actually strong enough to contain. Clara walked through the door and put her arms around her father, and neither of them said anything for a long time. They sat at his small kitchen table with 2 cups of tea that went cold while he talked, and he talked for 2 hours. He told her everything. What he had found. How he had found it. The meeting with Vincent Vittorio, which had gone the way he had hoped Vincent had listened, had understood, had told him to give him 48 hours before doing anything else. He had given Vincent 48 hours. On the 47th hour, 2 of Marco's men had been waiting for him outside his office. They had driven him to a property in western Massachusetts. They had asked him questions for 8 hours. He had told them nothing, not because he was heroic, he said, but because he understood by then that what he said didn't matter. What he said would not change what happened next. The only question was what Marco decided the risk calculation required. Marco had decided that a man with a wife and a daughter was more controllable alive and disappeared than dead and mourned. The terms had been delivered with absolute clarity. He would leave. He would not contact his family. He would not surface in any context that could be connected to the Vittorio organization or to Marco Bellini. In exchange, his family would remain exactly as they were, untouched, safe-watched, but not harmed. He had people watching you, Robert said. For the first 2 years, I know he did. I had no way of confirming when that stopped. I couldn't risk it. It stopped, Clara said. The surveillance stopped approximately 3 years ago. He got comfortable. I didn't know that. I know you didn't. He looked at her across the table. How did you find me? He said. And how did you, Clara? How did you do all of this? She told him. She told him about the envelope in the coat lining, about the USB drives in the toolbox and the folk song password, about 4 years of preparation and 7 weeks inside the Vittorio estate, about Damien and Walsh and the backup records and the 12 pages she had found in the basement archive. She told him about the last line. He needs to know who Marco Bellini really is. He sat very still when she said it. I wrote that, he said, as if he needed to say it out loud to make it real. I know. I wrote that thinking I don't know what I was thinking, that someone might find it, that it might matter to someone eventually. He stopped. I didn't think my daughter was going to walk into that house and do what I couldn't do. You did do it, Clara said. You got the evidence to Vincent. You documented everything. You left the archive pages for someone to find. You did your part. I just finished it. 6 years late. It finished when it was able to finish, she said. Marco Bellini is in federal custody. Walsh has everything. The case is moving. It's done. He looked at the table for a long moment. Your mother, he said. She wants you to know the pasta went bad, Clara said. He looked up at her. She said you told me to eat it, and I didn't, and it went bad, and she's been meaning to tell you for 6 years. Something happened to his face that was too complicated to name grief and relief, and 6 years of distance and love that had survived 6 years of distance. All of it arriving simultaneously in the face of a man whose self-control had held for 6 years and was now in a small apartment kitchen in Montreal at 2 a.m, finally not holding. I should call her, he said. Yes, Clara said. You should. She stood up from the table and took her cold tea to the window to give him the room, and she listened to her father dial a number he had not dialed in 6 years, and say a name he had not let himself say out loud in 6 years. And she looked out the window at Montreal, quiet in the middle of the night, and she thought about all the different kinds of courage there are. The courage of walking into a dangerous house. The courage of staying silent to protect the people you love. The courage of an ordinary man who discovered something extraordinary and tried to do the right thing with it even when the cost was everything. She listened to her father's voice crack on her mother's name, and she let it be what it was. She stayed in Montreal for 2 days. There were practical things that needed to happen. Walsh's team needed to interview Robert formally to take his account of everything that had occurred and add it to the record that was now building around the federal case against Marco Bellini. Walsh came up from Boston herself, which Clara had not expected, and she treated Robert Bennett with the particular careful respect of someone who understands what a witness has cost themselves to become. Robert was a precise and careful witness. Of course he was. He was an accountant who had spent 4 years documenting fraud before he disappeared, and 6 years reviewing every detail of what had happened in his mind, with no one to talk to about it. He remembered dates, names, exact language from conversations that had taken place 6 years ago. He walked Walsh through every piece of it with the methodical thoroughness that Clara recognized completely because she had inherited it. Walsh, at the end of the second day, looked at Robert and then at Clara and said, "The two of you are the same person." Robert looked at his daughter. "She's better than I am," he said. "She found the folk song password faster than I would have." Clara said, "You underestimated how many times I'd heard you hum it." It was the first moment in 2 days that felt light enough to breathe in. She flew back to Boston on the third morning with her father. He had spent 20 minutes before they left the Montreal apartment, standing in the middle of the room, looking at the small, careful life he had constructed in a foreign city, under conditions he had not chosen, the life of a man making himself invisible, for the same reason she had spent 7 weeks making herself invisible. She watched him look at it and didn't say anything. He picked up 2 things before they left: a photograph frame that she couldn't see from where she was standing, and a notebook worn at the corners that he put in his jacket pocket with the automatic precision of long habit. She didn't ask about either one. On the plane somewhere over the border between Canada and New England, he reached into his jacket pocket and took out the notebook and held it in both hands without opening it. "I kept records," he said. "Even here, I couldn't stop. I kept documenting. Everything I remembered, everything I could reconstruct." He paused. "I don't know if it's useful at this point." "Give it to Walsh," Clara said immediately. "It might be repetitive." "Give it to Walsh," she said again. "Whatever you documented, it has value. It always has value." He looked at the notebook. "Your mother is going to want to. She's going to need time," he said. "To be angry. She deserves to be angry. I made a decision that affected her for 6 years, and she didn't have the ability to choose." "Yes," Clara said. "She's going to be angry." "I know." "She's also going to hug you for about 45 minutes straight and not let go," Clara said. "I know her." He was quiet for a moment. "I know her too," he said. "That's the part that kept me going." Jed. Eleanor Bennett was waiting at the house when the car pulled up. She was standing on the front porch, which Clara had expected, because her mother had always been a person who waited for things on the front porch. Birthdays, school buses. Christmas morning, the mail carrier with packages, every form of anticipated arrival. She had been that way before, and she was that way now, standing with her hands clasped in front of her and her face doing the thing that Clara had only seen twice in her life. The thing that happened when Eleanor Bennett was feeling something too large for her usual containment to handle. Robert got out of his car. He stood on the front walk and looked at his wife for a moment. "Elle," he said. Eleanor walked down the porch steps and crossed the front walk in 4 steps, and then she was there, and they were both there, and Clara stayed by the car and let it be what it was. What it was 6 years of distance and silence and fear and love, ending on the front walk of a house on a quiet street in Boston, in the middle of an ordinary Wednesday afternoon. What it was the beginning of a conversation that would last for weeks. The anger and the explanation and the grief and the reconstruction of trust across the space that 6 years of necessary silence had carved between 2 people who loved each other. It would not be easy. Clara knew her mother well enough to know that Eleanor Bennett's relief would not prevent her from eventually saying clearly, and with full feeling, everything she had a right to say about 6 years of believing her husband was gone. But it would happen. The conversation would happen. Because they were both standing on the same front walk in the same city, breathing the same October air. Clara walked up the porch steps and went inside to give them the front walk. She called Damien that evening. He picked up on the first ring. "Your father," he said immediately. "Home," she said. "Both of them on the front walk. I gave them some space." "Good." A pause, and in the pause, she heard what she had learned to hear underneath Damien's pauses, the thing that his control covered but didn't entirely eliminate. "Good," he said again. "Walsh has everything," Clara said. "My father's notebook from the past 6 years, his formal statement. Walsh says the federal case is solid enough that she expects Marco to take a deal rather than go to trial. She said his attorney has already initiated preliminary conversations about cooperation." "Marco cooperating," Damien said. "She thinks he'll give up the Miami network, Reyes and the people around him. He'll trade what he knows about the federal protection infrastructure for a reduced sentence. He'll spend the rest of his life in a federal facility either way," Damien said. "Yes," Clara said. "Just how comfortable a facility depends on how much he decides to give." A brief silence. "And the organization," she said. She had been thinking about this since the meeting 2 days ago. The Vittorio organization existed with or without Marco. It was larger than any one person, and it had survived its own history of internal disruption before. What happened to it now was a question that belonged entirely to Damien, and she had not asked because it was not her question to ask. But she was asking now. "I've been thinking about that for a long time," Damien said. "Longer than the past week, longer than the financial review. And I spoke to Walsh about what a restructuring would look like, what it would require, what the organization would look like on the other side of it." He paused. "It's not going to be a quick process. Some of what this organization has done cannot be undone, and some of the people in it have decisions behind them that Walsh's framework requires accounting for, including some of mine." "But you're doing it," Clara said. "I told you that night. I chose something different." His voice was even the specific evenness of a decision that has been made and does not require drama to confirm its reality. "My father built something that he believed in. Marco spent 11 years corrupting it from the inside. I'm not going to let the corruption be the final definition of what it was." A pause. "Walsh's cooperation framework gives me a path. It's narrow, and it's long, and it requires me to accept some things I would prefer not to accept. But it exists." "Your father would have taken that path," Clara said. "If he had known what my father brought him, he would have taken it." "I think so too," Damien said. That said. 2 weeks later, Clara walked back into the Vittorio estate. Not as a maid. Damien had asked her to come. He had said it simply with no additional framing. "I'd like you to see what it looks like now." And she had understood that this was its own kind of statement, that being asked to see something as it changed was different from being asked to be part of changing it, and that the distinction mattered to him. The estate looked the same. The bones of it were unchanged. The hallways, the rooms, the kitchen that smelled like coffee and cleaning solution, the rose bushes along the east wall that Felix had already pruned for the coming winter. The framed photographs still hung in the upstairs hallway. What was different was harder to name, and more real for being harder to name. The staff moved differently. Not dramatically, they had always been professional, and their professionalism remained. But the particular quality of tension that Clara had registered her first day, the background frequency of people being careful in a space where the wrong word to the wrong person had consequences, that was gone. Or starting to go. These things dissolve slowly in layers as people learn over time that the conditions that created them have changed. She stood in the upstairs hallway and looked at the framed photograph at the end of it. Vincent Vittorio and his wife and a small boy between them squinting against summer sun. She heard footsteps and Damien came to stand beside her. They both looked at the photograph. "He knew," Damien said, "when your father came to him. He had known something was wrong for a while. He told your father, according to what my father's personal secretary told me last week, when she finally felt safe enough to tell me what she'd witnessed. He told your father that he was grateful, that he'd been looking for someone honest enough to bring him what he suspected." Clara looked at Vincent Vittorio's face in the photograph. He didn't have enough time to act on it, she said. No, but he knew. Damien paused. I think that matters to you. It matters to my father, she said. He spent 6 years wondering whether it had meant anything, whether Vincent had believed him. She looked at the photograph. It meant everything. He just never got to know that. He knows now, Damien said. She turned from the photograph. What happens to this house? She said. It stays a house, Damien said. The legitimate operations continue. The restructuring Walsh has outlined requires the legitimate side to function transparently, which it can, which it always could have. He paused. The rooms that were used for other things are going to be used for other things. Such as, I'm working on that, he said. I have some thoughts. They're going to sound unusual. Tell me anyway. He looked at her for a moment. There are people in this neighborhood in this city who operate in spaces adjacent to what this organization has historically represented. People who need legal resources they can't access. People who need financial support structures that the standard systems don't provide. People who need someone with this organization's reach to use it on their behalf rather than against them. He paused. It's a long way from what this house has been. But the infrastructure exists. The relationships exist. The question is what you do with them. Clara looked at him. You've been thinking about this for a long time, she said. Since before the financial review, he said. Since before last week. Since... He stopped. Since I was 25 and my father was explaining to me how the organization worked, and I understood for the first time what it meant to have power and what power asks of the people who hold it. And you're ready to do something different with it. I'm ready to try, he said, which was, Clara thought, the more honest version of yes. She looked down the hallway. The same hallway she had walked for 7 weeks, with a cleaning cart and eyes on the floor and a mind that was doing something entirely other than what the cart suggested. I have a proposal, she said. Damien waited. Walsh's cooperation framework requires ongoing financial transparency verification. Someone to monitor the restructuring process to confirm that what's being represented as clean is actually clean to maintain the integrity of the documentation over time. She paused. You need someone who understands both the financial architecture and the legal framework. Someone who can operate with enough independence to be credible to Walsh's office, but enough proximity to the organization to understand what they're looking at. Yes, Damien said. I've been trying to find that person. I have a candidate, she said. Who? Robert Bennett, she said. He spent years documenting what corruption looks like from the inside. He understands the architecture better than anyone because he's the one who found the seams in it. He's credible to Walsh because he's already given her 6 years of independently verified documentation. She paused. And he needs something to come home to, not just his wife and his daughter. Something that makes the 6 years mean something forward, not just backward. Damien looked at her for a long moment. You've been building this for 2 weeks, he said. I've been thinking about it, she said, since the flight back from Montreal. Does he know? Not yet. I wanted to know whether the position was real before I asked him. It's real, Damien said, if he's willing. He's willing, Clara said. He spent his career doing exactly this kind of work for people who didn't deserve his honesty. He'd like to do it once for someone who does. Damien held her gaze. And you, he said. What's your proposal for yourself? She had thought about this too. She had thought about it the way she thought about every problem methodically, honestly, without allowing herself to arrive at a conclusion she hadn't actually earned. I've been working toward one thing for 4 years, she said. I don't have a next thing yet, but I've learned something about myself in the past 7 weeks. What? I'm very good at walking into rooms where I'm not supposed to be and finding things that are hidden. She paused. I suspect there are other rooms, other things that need finding, people who need someone with those particular skills working on their behalf. Walsh mentioned something, Damien said carefully. Clara looked at him. She said her office has a civilian consultation framework. For people with specific expertise who don't fit the standard investigative profile but whose skills are demonstrably useful. He paused. She said the conversation was open if you were interested. When did she say that? Yesterday. You've been talking to Walsh about me. Walsh has been asking about you, Damien said. I've been providing truthful answers. A pause. She described you as the most effective non-law enforcement asset she has encountered in 15 years of organized crime work. She said it with the tone of someone who was being conservative. Clara absorbed this. It's a different kind of invisible, she said slowly. Working adjacent to federal investigations, you're still the person nobody fully accounts for. You're very good at invisible, Damien said. I'm tired of invisible, she said. That's the thing. I'm good at it, but I'm done with it as a permanent condition. He nodded. Walsh knows that, he said. She's not proposing invisible. She's proposing visible in rooms that matter. Clara looked at the hallway again, the framed photographs, the bones of a house that was becoming something different, without losing what it had always been underneath the corruption. A place where people lived and worked and tried to build things that would outlast the mistakes that had been made in its rooms. She thought about her father at his kitchen table, humming over his numbers. She thought about 7 weeks of pushing a cleaning cart through these halls with her eyes on the floor and her mind on something entirely else. She thought about the moment she had walked into that meeting room and spoken across the full length of a table full of powerful men to the most dangerous one in the room. She had stopped being invisible in that moment. She had been visible ever since. Three months later, the Vittorio estate felt like a house again. Robert Bennett started his first day in his new role on a Monday morning in January, arriving at 8 a.m. with his second-hand briefcase and his worn notebook, and the particular quality of a man who has been given the chance to do the thing he was built to do in a context that deserves it. Damien met him at the door himself. Clara watched from the hallway. She watched her father shake Damien Vittorio's hand. Watched Damien hold it a moment longer than a professional greeting required, and say something she couldn't hear from where she was standing. Watched her father's face when he heard it, the complicated, earned, hard-won expression of a man receiving something he had stopped believing was possible. She didn't need to hear the words. She knew what kind of thing it was. She had been present for the version of it that had happened inside her in a car on a night when everything was still uncertain, and a man had said 2 words, "We'll find him with the weight of a commitment rather than the lightness of a comfort." Her father walked through the door of the Vittorio estate as the man he had always been, an honest accountant who had made himself visible when visibility cost everything, and for the first time in 6 years, what he was, walked into a room that was ready to receive it. Walsh called her at 9:15 the same morning. "The Marco Bellini case has a sentencing date," Walsh said. 8 weeks out. His cooperation has produced 17 additional indictments across 3 states. The Reyes network is largely dismantled. Reyes himself is cooperating on the federal obstruction charges. A pause. "Your father's testimony is part of the formal record. His name is in the case documentation as originating source." "I know," Clara said. "He saw it last week. How did he take it?" Clara thought about her father sitting at his kitchen table, the real one, the one in the house in Boston. Not the small Montreal table she had sat across in the middle of the night with the federal case documentation in his hands. Reading his own name in a federal record for the first time. The particular stillness of a man who has waited 6 years to be officially real again. "He asked if he could keep a copy," Clara said. Walsh was quiet for a moment. "He can keep a copy," she said. "I told him." "Clara." Walsh's voice shifted to something that was not the professional register, but the human one underneath it. "The consultation framework conversation. Have you thought more about it?" "Yes," Clara said. "And I have conditions," Clara said. "I expected you would." "I work cases I choose," Clara said. "I'm not a staff member, And I'm not an asset in the traditional sense. I'm a consultant with independent judgment and the ability to withdraw from any engagement where the parameters change beyond what I've agreed to. She paused. And my father's role in this case is acknowledged in any public context where the investigation is discussed. Not buried. Acknowledged. Done, Walsh said. What else? Clara looked out the window at the Boston winter gray and specific the city going about its ordinary morning business below. That's it, she said. Then we have an agreement, Walsh said. We have an agreement, Clara said. Mafia. She went back to the Vittorio estate that afternoon, not for anything specific. Damien had not asked her to come. She came because there was something she wanted to do that she had thought about since the first week she walked away from it without doing it. She went to the upstairs hallway. She stood in front of the framed photograph at the end of it. Vincent Vittorio and his wife and the small boy between them, summer sun and squinting eyes, and a moment that existed before everything changed. She stood there, and she looked at it for as long as she wanted to. Not 4 seconds. Not the carefully managed glance of someone controlling how much a photograph is allowed to cost them. She looked at it until she had seen everything it contained. The happiness that had been real, the family that had existed, the man who had sat across a table from her father and said, "I'm grateful," before Marco Bellini took away his ability to act on it. Then she turned from the photograph and walked down the hallway. Damien was coming up the stairs at the other end. He stopped when he saw her. "I didn't know you were here," he said. "I came to look at the photograph," she said. "I've been meaning to." He looked down the hallway toward the end of it. "It's a good photograph," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." They stood in the hallway for a moment, the length of it between them, the photograph at one end and the staircase at the other. The bones of a house that had been through things that houses shouldn't have to hold and was still underneath all of it, someone's actual home. "Walsh called," she said. "The consultation framework. I accepted." Something in his face changed in the particular way she had learned to read. Not an expression, the space around an expression, the thing his control covered and didn't fully cover. "Good," he said. "It will mean I'm in and out of various situations over the next year or so," she said. "Walsh has a list." "I imagine she does. Some of them may connect back to things you're restructuring. There may be overlap. There may be," he said with the complete equanimity of someone who does not consider overlap a problem. She looked at him. "Damien." "Yes." "Thank you," she said. "For the car that night. For believing me when there was no reason to yet. For all of it." He looked back at her. "Your father tried to save mine," he said. "And you finished what your father started. There's no version of this where I'm the one being thanked." "There is," she said. "Because you could have had me removed from that meeting room and let whatever happened happen. You didn't. You listened." She paused. "Not everyone listens." He held her gaze for a moment. "No," he said. "They don't." She walked past him toward the staircase. "I'll be in touch when Walsh's first case briefing comes through," she said. "I'll be here," Damien said. She went down the stairs and through the kitchen and out into the January cold. And she stood for a moment on the back step of the Vittorio estate, the same back door she had told a man to leave through on the night that changed everything. And she let the cold air in and felt the full shape of where she was standing. On the other side, her father was inside a building 3 miles away, doing the work he was built to do in a context that deserved his honesty. Her mother had stopped shrinking away from the world. Walsh had a list. The case was moving. Marco Bellini was going to spend the rest of his life accounting for 11 years of choices in a room he didn't choose. And Clara Bennett, who had spent 4 years learning to be invisible and 7 weeks performing invisibility inside the most dangerous house in Boston, was standing at the back door of that house in January, and she was exactly as visible as she had decided to be. The world had underestimated a maid. They had looked at the uniform and seen the limit of her. They had looked at the cleaning cart and seen the ceiling of what she could want, or know, or do. They had moved through halls she was standing in, and spoken in rooms she was cleaning, and made decisions they believed were invisible to her, because they had never once considered that the person standing quietly in the background sees everything. But that was finished now. Clara Bennett was not the maid who warned the Mafia boss. She was the woman who had walked into the dark with 4 years of evidence, and her father's handwriting, and the absolute refusal to let the truth stay buried just because the system designed to bury it was larger and older and more powerful than she was. She was the woman who had finished what an honest man started. And she was done being underestimated.